I need to stand here,
Yes.
right? And I'm not Sadiq Khan, as you can see, but I have some words from him as well. I'm proud to welcome the international heritage sector to our city. London is not only home to 4 UNESCO World Heritage Sites, but also a city driving the debate on representation in the public realm. Our Commission for Diversity in the Public Realm was established in 2020 to enable Londoners to enrich and add to the stories and histories told across our capital. And I'm pleased to see ICOMOS, UNESCO and the University of Greenwich coming together to explore the same values and ideas. Oops, it's gone blank. Just elaborating on that a little bit more, I am just one of the commissioners. There's a whole panel of experts across various sectors, including artists and architects and others. And I particularly focus on contested heritage in my writing and in my work. And so far, the commission's been going 2 years. It's been extended for another year. A lot of the work today has been about, to date, has been about rebalancing the commemorative landscape, letting 1,000 flowers bloom. So lots of commissioning of grassroots commemorations and initiatives, arts-led projects, lots of artists involved across the city to people who are to make visible often the lives and stories of people often invisible, people of colour, queer people, women who are not represented in the traditional monumental environment. And there are some emblematic projects as part of that. Recently was announced the new London memorial to the victims of the transatlantic slave trade outside the Museum of London, which is a fantastic achievement, and that's going to have one main site there and satellite representations across the city as well. That's in its earliest stages. So far, the contested element that I look at is not addressed, and on a personal note, I would like to see what we do about the problematic past, what we do about the problematic past in our World Heritage Sites, because with the Naval College Parliaments, there's certainly plenty of problematic presence to address. But it's how to do that. I mean, I think the Mayor's approach has been very sensible to avoid stoking culture wars by adding new memorials, by not taking away, and I think addition rather than subtraction is the way forward, and that is a way that we ensure that the rights of everybody are respected, that the cosmopolitan is respected, and that what's going to say the right to dignity in the humanitarian terms is part of your physical environment as well. And I think that what we have in terms of government policy, in terms of retain and explain, is very much emphasis on the retain, and there's very little explain going on. There, including, for example, the small plaque about roads at Oriel College. I think we've got to be more inventive and creative about how we tackle sites of honour and how we maybe, when it's appropriate, undercut that honour and turn problem sites into thinking sites. Thank you.
Robert, thank you very much indeed for that. That was a very encouraging few words, and we're very grateful to the Mayor. We know that he takes heritage very seriously in London and beyond, and is an active supporter of community engagement. So we're indebted to him for sending us such an encouraging message. So thank you. I'd now like to hand over to Clara Arokiasamy, who is our president of ICOMOS-UK, who's going to say something about our organisation and the context for today's event. So Clara, would you like to join us up on the podium? Thank you.
Hello, and morning, and welcome. It's nice to see so many familiar faces as well as new ones, online as well as here in person. welcome to the conference, embedding rights-based approach into World Heritage sites and generally in heritage conservation, and decolonisation, a topic that people discuss with some hesitancy and caution. But today is a free day. We can discuss it freely. And it's also good to see both community groups and professionals and practitioners in the same room all together at once. It's very rarely this happens. It's usually they're segregated into professionals, community groups, and activists, and so on. But here today, we have all of them together, which is a good sign. My job this morning is to just briefly set up the purpose of this conference. But before I do that, I'd like to tell you about ICOMOS. I'm sure not all of you know about ICOMOS. ICOMOS is an international non-governmental organization. It was set up in 1965 and the only global organization of its kind dedicated to promoting the application of theory, methodology, and scientific techniques to the conservation of the architectural and archaeological heritage. It is one of the 3 international advisors to the UNESCO's World Heritage Committee, the other 2 being IUCN and ICROM. It's made up of a network of 110 national committees and around 11,000 individual members based in 151 countries. So it is stretched across the world. It's a broad church and its members come from all disciplines engaged with conservation of tangible and intangible heritage. They range from architects, archaeologists, art historians to geographers, anthropologists, engineers, town planners, project managers to museologists, craftspeople, and I could go on. ICOMOS has 30 international scientific committees, which are its technical bodies. They undertake research, develop theory, guidelines, and charters on various cultural heritage themes and promote international exchange of scientific information. To date, it has adopted 36 international and 7 national charters and doctrinal texts, which provides standards and act as a key reference point, both for many individual practitioners and for organizations involved in conservation of monuments and sites in the UK and worldwide. Disseminating this body of knowledge is the key role of its scientific and national committees and its worldwide membership of some 11,000 people. So who are we? We call ourselves ICOMOS-UK. Who are we? The organizers of this conference. We are one of the 110 national committees in the network and were set up in 1965, same time as the international ICOMOS. And our structure mirrors that of the international body as much as is possible. We adjust to local needs as well. Our membership is between 470 and 500, and we have 8 scientific committees, including a World Heritage Committee. So you're welcome to join those committees, become ICOMOS member. We provide advice on World Heritage processes to the DCMS, heritage agencies, World Heritage steering committees, and anyone who needs advice on heritage conservation. We work on a pro bono basis. Nobody pays us. Our members actively contribute to ICOMOS's international work and share UK's good practice with ICOMOS colleagues and others globally. Now, I'd like to turn to the purpose of today's conference. Impacts of natural disasters, armed conflicts, displacement, migration and movement of people across the globe, and the erosion of human and cultural rights brought about by past and present environmental, social, and political factors affect and pose risks to most, if not all, aspects of culture and heritage, including World Heritage sites. These issues cut across all heritage domains. Hence, they're commonly referred to as cross-cutting issues. They affect the sustainability of heritage and the communities who live in and around those heritage sites. ICOMOS has been at the forefront of identifying key impacts and developing mitigating policies and practices for many cross-cutting issues. Two notable examples of this work are its response to climate change through culture-based actions, and the other is a rights-based approach to ensure that all communities have the right to be fully involved in safeguarding their heritage for now and for future generations. The 2019 ICOMOS report, The Future of Our Past, Engaging Cultural Heritage in Climate Action, produced by ICOMOS's Climate Change Working Group, provides an exemplar framework for developing climate actions. It underpinned our conference in London. It was an online during COVID time, called Promoting Cultural Heritage as a Key Driver for Local Climate Action in 2021. The focus of the conference was on how national agencies in the UK could better engage with local communities in translating research and policies into practical community actions, using cultural heritage as a key driver. It was one of the few conferences in the UK that had taken a bottom-up approach, placing communities at the heart of climate change policymaking. The community theme continues with this conference today, which is designed to explore yet another cross-cutting issue, rights-based approaches, which is concerned with the rights of communities to be involved in the identification, interpretation, presentation, and stewarding of world heritage. To this end, we are drawing on the work of yet another ICOMOS International Working Group, set up a decade ago. The Right-Based Approaches Working Group has been involved in creating awareness about communities' rights relating to World Heritage and heritage management in general, and the development of tools and guidelines for use in all stages of the World Heritage processes, starting with the formulation of tentative lists through to nominations and management of sites once they're inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. Bénédicte Selfslagh, our second keynote speaker, and who has been part of the working group since its early days, will offer us some insights into the group's achievements to date, and the morning panelists will highlight the complexities involved in community engagement and provide examples of good practice, including the management of challenges and conflicts when involving communities as equal partners in heritage conservation and management. There are 33 World Heritage Sites in the UK, spread across the 4 nations and in the UK's overseas territories. 4 of them are in London. This place, Maritime, Greenwich, where we are today, the Palace of Westminster, including Westminster Abbey and St. Margaret's Church, the Tower of London, and Kew Gardens, Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. All 4 are in one of the most super diverse cities in the world and have strong connections with Britain's colonial past and empire. But how many of London's white residents, diaspora and migrant communities know of these sites and their connections with Britain's dark past? How have the people of London been involved in their interpretation? And what opportunities have the various communities have had in telling their stories about their own and their ancestors' connections to those sites? Do the workforce reflect the diverse cultures of London? These kinds of questions are critical in enabling many of our World Heritage Sites to unpack and represent their colonial and empire history in partnership with the relevant communities. Professor Dan Hicks, our first keynote speaker, will look at the narratives around decolonisation and what they mean for World Heritage Sites across the UK. And the afternoon panelists will examine more closely the decolonisation of UK's maritime heritage and the narrative and presentation of the transatlantic slave trade and the decolonisation of Scottish heritage. This conference is also a timely intervention in responding to the new requirement adopted by the World Heritage Committee in 2021, which requires all state parties to identify stakeholders, including owners, inhabitants, indigenous peoples, and local communities, governmental, non-governmental, private stakeholders, and right holders as applicable, and demonstrate the extent of participation in the nomination process of stakeholders and right holders through inter alia making nomination publicly available in appropriate languages and through public consultations and hearings. equally demonstrate the extent of consultation and collaboration with stakeholders and right holders in the management of nominated property. And if such information is not provided, the nomination dossier would be considered incomplete. I've selected that text from the actual document, UNESCO's Operation Guidelines. So hence it is very technical, but that needs to be unpacked for communities as well. Phil Foxwood may wish to comment on DCMS views on this new requirement in his statement to the conference, especially in the light of the recent announcement of the new tentative list by DCMS. I hope this event is a catalyst in bringing about change in the way communities are empowered to be involved in looking after World Heritage in the UK, and the start of a decolonisation programme of World Heritage sites. Please use the breakout groups to tell us your views and what support you would like from ICOMOS-UK in engaging with topics that are being covered here today. Finally, I'd like to thank all speakers for their contribution to this seminal event for ICOMOS-UK and the sponsors who have been credited in the programme for their generous financial and in-kind support, without which we would not have been able to hold this conference. My thanks to staff and volunteers and trustees who worked hard on the planning and the execution of this conference. Enjoy the day and the post-conference tour of the Painted Hall, which mustn't be missed. Thank you, and thank you for being here.
Our keynote speaker, Professor Dan Hicks of the Pitt Rivers Museum, will be talking about decolonisation and decolonising World Heritage in the UK and lots of other interesting things. So Dan, a very warm welcome to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Wonderful to be here. I'm just going to put on my timer because I've been asked to speak for half an hour or so, and I think we have an opportunity to have some sort of conversations for maybe 10 minutes after that. On the theme of the decolonisation of World Heritage, and I'm afraid the short version of the talk is we're not going to have decolonise anything, including the World Heritage site in which we find ourselves in half an hour, and actually maybe not at all, because maybe that isn't the language we need. But I also wonder whether the language that we've already heard so far this morning is equally the language that we need. We've heard about addition rather than removal, and it's hard to imagine any other aspect of society in which addressing racism and legacy racism would happen. If we think about healthcare, if we think about policing, if we think about business, how we could address institutional racism without having to make some changes and to make removals. So I do worry a great deal about that language that's coming out of London, it seems. So I want to start by observing, though, that if we were having this conversation in a North American sort of context, we might start with a land acknowledgement. We might start by saying that we were having the conversation on stolen land, which of course is not the case here. But we can, I think, at the same time find ways to talk about where we're speaking from, not least because we are only 3 days after Stephen Lawrence Day and 30 years after the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence on Well Hall Road in Eltham, of course, under 4 miles away from where we're having this conversation today. And of course, out of that incident, that horror, that murder in 93, we got the Macpherson report in 99, which, for those who don't remember, I'm old enough to remember the conversations we were having in the heritage sector in the wake of that report. That notion of institutional racism was at the heart of conversations we were just starting to have in the around the turn of the millennium, in terms of what that means for us. Maybe culture is involved in racism in the same way as any other part of society, and maybe heritages as well. Fast forward to 2021 and we get the Sewell report, which of course sought to say that institutional racism simply does not exist. And to make the argument, and I want to quote one little line that a lot of people notice, that for some groups, historic experience of racism still haunts the present. The notion that institutional racism does not exist, that assertion, is fundamentally intellectually based on an argument that racism was in the past, that empire was in the past, that this is over. Although, of course, as we learn from the North American conversations over the carceral state, over mass incarceration, over how to address racism in the criminal justice system, we learn fundamentally that the work of abolition is not over. The work of emancipation is not over. This is an ongoing process, an unfinished sort of process. So my first main point really, I guess, is that we have to accept that in all sorts of ways, colonialism is not over. We're not in, this isn't a post-colonial conversation, as some academics in the past maybe would have called it. We can learn, and I hope we do learn, the lessons from our museums, where there's a recognition that for some of the history of those institutions, they were co-opted for the purposes of the cultural supremacy and that ideology that was so important to empire, not a long way away from London or from the metropole, but at the heart of empire, here in London and in other cities across the UK and across Europe. So restitution, of course, which has been mainstream work that we in the museums undertake all the time, which is, I'm afraid, not about adding, it's about being open to taking away and to giving back, and being open to acknowledging debt, not shame, not apologies, but active returns in the present. That work has started. We can learn not only from museums, but from the removal of racist images in the streets. We might think of Milligan outside the museum in Docklands, who was only actually erected in its most recent form as recently as the late 1990s, before it was officially moved by the mayor in 2020. We could learn from the verdict on the Colston 4, where, of course, importantly, the judge's framing was asking the jury, who, of course, exonerated the Colston 4, to weigh up two different sorts of crime. There were two crimes happening. There was the crime against the property in Bristol, which was against this image from 1895 of an 18th century slaver erected in order to promote this sort of high colonial moment of an ideology of seeking to celebrate that past. So to weigh up that that action against the thing versus the hate crime of allowing it to continue to stand. So we have to think in those ways. We can learn in all those ways then that it isn't that in a general sense empire isn't over. It remains not over in certain locations because it was inbuilt, hardwired into our culture, at the time. So the co-option, all those who care about art and heritage and our museums and our historic environment really have to be aware of the fact that for certain moments of its history, it was misused. And so we shouldn't be afraid to make those sorts of changes. So, but what on earth would that mean for World Heritage Sites? Are we going to decolonize them? So it isn't a term that I use. I prefer in my own work and learning from the colleagues with whom I work to think more about the unfinished work of anti-colonialism and the unfinished work of anti-racism. We can go with, in terms of the term of the notion of the decolonial, we can reach back to to tuck and yang in the academic literature. That's observation that the decolonisation is not a metaphor. We can reach back further to Audre Lorde with her important observation that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. We need root and branch and fundamental shifts in how we build and how we live in those ways. And we can reach back further to Fanon, and not only Fanon's awareness of the decolonisation process as something that wasn't just the end of empire, it was about the mind as well. But importantly for me, in my writing, I've learned a great deal from his essay on culture and racism, where he points out that 19th century ideologies of the fake race science started with natural history. They started with the racist lie that there were different sorts of humans, species of humans that were based on the physical body, but moved very fast onto a second form of racism into which anthropology, of course, and archaeology were involved. Those notions of different forms of civilization, or sort of levels of civilization, or different forms of culture in those ways. So the cultural racism that we inherit from the 19th century was obviously part of what he was writing about. But actually, more than anything, if you go away and read one thing that I mentioned today, it would be Samaya Kasim's important article, "The Museum Will Not Be Decolonized," where she reflected upon her involvement as a community participant in the Birmingham exhibit, The Past Is Now, that tried to look, and I think in some ways successfully looked, at aspects of the enduring nature of empire in the city of Birmingham. But the work, and often, of course, unpaid work, that is being expected to be done by community groups, by stakeholders, all the language that we see around this conference, in fact. There are enormous risks there when the aim to decolonize misses the fact that so much of this is inbuilt into the structures. So think back again to the moment that I started with, that moment where we were reading Macpherson and we were thinking, and there was a moment of hope. I think we're in another moment of hope. I guess that's where I'm going to end, is that this is a moment of hope. But there was a real moment of hope around the turn of the millennium, that at that point was really based on seeing historic sites and landscapes or buildings or museums as spaces for writing histories in a different way, for introducing other voices. We've had some of that language already this morning. So that sense, for example, I mean, we would think about the National Trust starting to talk about that sort of, Jane Austen line about the relationship between country houses and the profits of the transatlantic slave trade. There were conversations around Ironbridge. There were conversations around Liverpool. Unfortunately, we don't have those conversations in this venue around Liverpool in the same way as we might have done. And I wonder what that tells us about the supposedly decolonial and how that decision gets made and how we've lost Liverpool, for God's sake, from this list. We could talk about Edinburgh, we could talk about where we are today, of course, fundamentally, but so much of that was the sort of, a bit like we heard earlier, the retain and explain. We're going to write little notes and we're going to put them on the wall next to the other little notes. And as if historians were going to offer the answer, as if all we had to do was to recontextualize, as if we could add another layer onto these histories simply by redescribing or reinterpreting, but we must never, touch the thing itself. Whereas, of course, fundamentally, the thing about curating sites, the thing about adding to lists, which we'll hear about soon, is that we're making those sites from which we are going to make those interpretations. We can't just say there's something called the heritage that we just interpret in different ways. That model, that 90s fix, that reflexive moment, that sense of being self-aware, that notion that what we need from a site is a situated knowledge, that is really bankrupt at this point. Because what happens with the reflexive heritage practice or the critical heritage practice is that you remove someone that looked like me from this conversation and then you reintroduce them and it's the same guy slightly more sensitive this time, slightly more self-aware, but nothing else actually changes apart from the words that are being used. How do we see real change like we might see, like we have seen in healthcare, like we've seen in the criminal justice system, like we've seen in business? What does the heritage sector look like in terms of that sort of change? How do we do that? Which of course is the answer to why there's been this stepping away from the moment, what some saw as a moment in the movement for Black lives, which of course has a long history, far earlier and far deeper than simply the events of 2020. But we're seeing a stepping away because of the anti-colonialists, because of the emergence of a new narrative that seeks to turn this fundamental historical shift, a shift in historical consciousness that we're seeing across Europe, as I want to finish on as a point. But we're seeing that happening, and we're seeing a pushback that wants to say, oh no, you've got to balance that. It's a balance sheet. There was good and bad. Empire was a curate's egg. It was good in parts, and we mustn't miss out. All these sort of deplatformed dead white men, how must they feel, and how can we make sure that they're not sort of written out of history somehow? The fundamental mistake here is we're mistaking memory for history. We're not historians in this room. This isn't what we're doing. We can learn on that point in terms of pushback from the Haitian anthropologist Michel Rolfe-Truelot, who I'm sure a lot of people in this room know, and his work, Silencing the Past, where he says that our historical consciousness is made up of mentions and silences. Who gets mentioned? Who gets silenced? How do we think in terms of memory? And of course, we saw that in early 2021, most vividly maybe in this country in terms of empire, with the report on the Commonwealth War Grave, the War Graves Commission, that underlined the differential forms of remembrance that happened for African and Indian soldiers who fought in the First World War as compared to British soldiers. So expand that out into landscapes and sites and buildings and what we used to call the heritage, and I don't know what we call it now, the historic built environment and our World Heritage Sites, and where do we end up? So rights-based approaches, stakeholders, the participatory, tick, 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 but still this is an institution. This is, you're part of an organization here who talk about universal value. That notion that has been so absolutely, it has become so outdated in the museum sector. It was used desperately in the late 90s to push back against restitution and the work of anti-racism. The universal was held up against the provincial or the national. How much of a risk is there that we repeat that with ICOMOS in the same way? So what are universal values, these Enlightenment values, this supposed, where do you stand? Where are you standing if you're holding universal values, and what does that look like? What are the alternatives? That seems to me the really productive work that this language of the participatory, this language of rights-based might actually find its way into practice being. So this then is not, as I've said, simply about being reflexive or situated in our thinking. This is about having to think about how we dismantle not only the sites, but the creation of sites, the adding to the list, the inscription practices, when these are sites that make themselves. They're sites that are not out there. We decide what's on the list and what isn't, as we learned, sadly, to the detriment of Liverpool. We can learn a great deal from, I think, the narratives internationally. That's a big theme of what I've been talking about. And I'd point you especially to the work on the legacies of enslavement in North America as being a very, very rich body of work that's emerging at the moment, and especially Christina Sharp's recent book, In the Wake, where she talks about the unfinished legacies of enslavement in the United States through this metaphor of the wake. And I think we need more metaphors in some ways to help us, not interpretations and not interpretation boards. Let's think about the language and how it can help us. For her, the word wake, in her hands, the wake evokes the track left on a water's surface by a ship, the disturbance caused by a body swimming or moved in water, a state of wakefulness or consciousness, the currents that are behind a body in flight, a region of disturbed flow, the recoil of a gun. We're dealing with the wake of empire here and now. If we walk down the road to the Cutty Sark, or if we go across town to the museum in Docklands, or if we visit all of those other World Heritage sites in this country, these are enduring legacies. These are legacy institutions. We're starting to talk now about the colonial museums in this country as legacy colonial institutions. What does that mean for the notion of the monument? And I speak, of course, in this context as someone who worked in an institution founded by the man that was the first inspector of ancient monuments in this country, and in many ways was not only assembling objects from all around the world, but central in the whole idea of monumentalization of the landscape, and almost turning the landscape itself into a sort of a museum exhibit. These ideas have histories. So we're at a moment, and these are my final points really, we're at a moment which is a pan-European moment and an international moment, where the attempt to sublimate a whole phase of our imperial history is failing. And institutional stopgaps that were put up in order to do that are failing. Here in the UK, our national conversation about empire for so long was focused on enslavement and the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, absolutely rightly. And there's so much more to talk about and to do in terms of that, as we see most recently with the foundation of the all-party parliamentary group on reparations and restitution. But so often the story, as Samaya Kasim says in the piece I mentioned earlier, became a story of the British sort of past, which was 2 world wars, 1 World Cup, and before that, abolition and emancipation. These were victories, missing out what started precisely in the 1840s after emancipation and continued via the Berlin Congress of 1884 right the way up to the fact we started having to fight fascism. The proto-fascist century in which the UK was involved, ideologically, in terms of the disciplines of anthropology and archaeology, in terms of how the colonial museums were co-opted, in terms of statues being erected in the streets, also in terms of our very idea of the monument itself, our idea of landscape, our idea of our relationship to landscape. So that's the case in the UK, but across Europe, there's an unfolding of a consciousness of that sort of period, whether it's in the announcements from the federal government of Germany and from Macron about returns, whether it's the national commissions established by the Belgians and the Swiss into colonial atrocities, whether indeed in the UK it's the conversations we're having in the regions, which are so different to this parochial, London-based, Westminster-based conversation where everyone's so frightened of a culture war, which of course that's the framing of the right. That's the framing of the extreme right. That's an attempt to silence us. That's an attempt to make a chilling effect upon these conversations in the first place. And we cannot, as a sector, intellectually or in terms of practice or in terms of any of the rhetoric, which will only be rhetoric if we allow it not to be challenged, that we're hearing in this conference over the course of the day, that will mean nothing if we give in to the idea that to have these conversations and to want to see our sector keep in step with our times, that somehow is an attack upon our institutions, rather than fundamentally a recognition that our institutions and our concepts and ideas were weaponized in the past and that now we need to disarm them. So with that isolated sense of Westminster and the London conversation in mind, which I have to say, as you travel across Europe, it is, and indeed across the UK, it is notable that the London conversation is really being left behind, whether from our national museums or whether from the influence of Westminster. All sorts of conversations are happening in very different ways. I'm sure we'll hear about some of them over the course of the day in the regions in the UK, but also across Europe as a whole. Fundamentally, how I would see this, though, is that this is a moment of great hope. I've never felt, as an archaeologist, anthropologist, a museum curator, someone that spent 10 years as a digging archaeologist, I've never felt more optimistic about my sector than I do right now. And that, I think, in some ways is because we're starting to frame things in this way, which is that we learn from the nature writers that maybe the major challenge that faces us in the present relates to how to be good ancestors, how to leave a world behind us that isn't full of toxic nuclear waste and overheated climate, the sea levels that are removing whole small island states, all the unexploded bombs in minefields across the world. That's our, for the environmentalists, that is our challenge. For those of us who are not nature writers or conservators of nature, even though obviously, World Heritage overlaps these two, I think we can do this in a productive way. But for those who care and work with not nature, but culture, what's our challenge? And I think it's the other side of the coin. It's the same challenge, but it's the other gesture, which is that we have to learn how to inherit well. We have to learn how to be good descendants. We have to be able to accept all that is so positive in our heritage, in our museums, in all aspects of arts and culture, but not accept that our job is to keep everything the same. This strange idea that we're the one sector that are told, no, you cannot change because what? It's heritage? How on earth how do we get ourselves here? How do we allow ourselves to get to the point where we give in to the retain and explain ideology, which is just designed to shut us up and to shut it down and to keep us and to put us into the past. So I do feel for those reasons that there's a lot to be hopeful of, because fundamentally we might mistake our job in the museums as the curators. We might mistake ourselves purely to be the conservator. We might imagine that our job is simply to stop the moths from eating the fabrics and to stop the ironwork from rusting away and to keep everything the same. But we're never, sometimes we've experienced a mission creep through which we've imagined that we can stop the world from changing around us. And of course, if any sector, if any institution ever lets that happen, they're going to soon find themselves very much out of step with the rest of the world and actually increasingly irrelevant. I don't want to see an obsolescence for our heritage sector. I want to keep us in step with our times, and I think so many of the conversations we'll hear over the course of the day will help us do that. So that's me. Thanks very much.
I'm delighted to be in Greenwich today, a World Heritage Site. And I was already very impressed by the program when I saw it. I have to confess that now I'm scared. I'm scared by the excellent first keynote that we listened to, but I'm also scared from you because your questions were so wonderful. You mentioned, are we using the language that we need? And of course, that's also very scary for me because I'm not a native speaker. However, I'm a proud Londoner. And I have to say that I have a lot of admiration for the efforts here in sharing or translating things in different languages. It's remarkable. I've lived in several places. I've never seen that before. And I come from a country where difference in languages is a real issue. Now, I have a problem because I'm not a native speaker, and you could misunderstand me quickly. But you have a problem as well, because you need to get attuned to my exotic accent. So bear with me. And if you don't understand me, or if you do not agree with me, let's say that before you skip to conclusions, let's have a dialogue. What I wanted to do today is not to go into examples, but rather provide you some structure. So 3 questions. What are participatory and rights-based approaches? How relevant are they for World Heritage? And what's the role of ICOMOS, its members, and you all? Well, I tried to make a kind of timeline where I put together text about rights, text about ICOMOS and its activities or milestones, and World Heritage and milestones. And I started actually with 1945, the UNESCO Constitution, which was adopted in London, because in its first article, there is a reference to peace and security, but also to respect for human rights and peoples of the world. The 2 first texts are universal documents. The European Convention on Human Rights, which you read a lot about in our newspapers, since I'm a Londoner. I have put it because it's also part of this family of texts adopted after World War II, but also to transmit the message that when you work on cultural, on human rights, it's very important to see what the context is of the legal documents and the rights documents in that area of the world. Let's add some documents of ICOMOS. Like your president said, ICOMOS was created in 1965, following a call when the Venice Charter was adopted, and it was created under the auspices of UNESCO. ICOMOS is not a human rights organization, so you will never find jargon, human rights jargon in the early text. But what is important is that ICOMOS, especially over the last decades, has been looking at working on human rights and how this connects to practice. And then I've added some text on international conventions and recommendations on heritage. Of course, you have in 1972 the adoption of the UNESCO World Heritage Convention. But I also want to draw your attention to the 1975 European Architectural Heritage Year and the declaration and the charter that was adopted at the time, and where the concept of integrated conservation was coined. And integrated conservation did not just mean integrated in urban planning. It had the social aspect, the integration with the social aspect. And this is crucial, and it's something that we forget. Why? Because for the European Architectural Heritage Year, there were several pilot cases all over Europe. And with heritage conservationists saw that when they tried to do some urban renewal, the result was often gentrification. And they realized that actually they did not want that. What they wanted was, of course, heritage conservation, but also for the benefit of people. And then they realized that let's say, the participation of the citizens and the work with the citizens was important at that time already. The other text that you will see, and I will come back to that, is the Fire Convention of 2005, which in fact coined the term of heritage communities and is also calling for participation. And at the end, in the black, you see the World Heritage Policy on Sustainability and the revisions of the operational guidelines, which Clara already mentioned, and where I will come in more detail. So let's now look first with ICOMOS. And I have added the preamble just to underscore that it's an international organization and that it's looking at heritage in its intangible and intangible aspects. But I come back also to the fact that the founding fathers of ICOMOS in fact underscored that we are living in heritage. Heritage is part, the built heritage and the landscapes are part of our daily life environments. So we cannot work without people. And ICOMOS is per se a people-centered NGO. And sometimes that's forgotten, but that should not be forgotten. Now, it's true that ICOMOS had attention from the very beginning for people, but practices and words have evolved. And at the time, we spoke about the general public and increasing awareness and education. Today, we speak about communities, rights-based approaches, and participatory approaches. I would like also to draw the attention to the ICOMOS ethical principles, because how cultural heritage is understood and treated by people is a fundamental issue, and the ethical principles already give you some elements on how to handle such issues. ICOMOS created an or common dignity and rights-based approaches working group, and I was very pleased to hear the words common dignity already this morning. And the aim of this group is to reflect the rights-based approaches across all ICOMOS activities. It works transversely, so with national committees, international scientific committees, and other working groups. And the idea is to contribute to the ICOMOS work plan. Now, the ICOMOS has this working group has since it exists about 10 years now, and it has already obtained quite remarkable results, even if we start at small scale. For instance, there was a change of perspective going from case studies, single cases, to a more framework approach. We contributed also to some policy changes. For instance, we made contributions to the UN Special Rapporteurs on Cultural Rights, to the International Court of Justice, when they were working on destruction, intentional destruction of cultural heritage, for the European Investment Bank, when they developed a policy on sustainable development. We were able to introduce the not only heritage, because they had that already, but also the rights-based approach to this. And of course, we worked also on World Heritage. Now, we added to the ICOMOS work program. We are triggering reflection, organizing training, webinars, conferences. We had declarations, resolutions, and of course, one of the important things is that ICOMOS, together with IUCN, the Organization for Nature Conservation, and ICRON, the Intergovernmental Organization for Capacity Building, we work together on World Heritage and human rights. And that The Our Common Dignity initiative was launched by ICOMOS in 2011. So it's different from our working group. This is really the 3 advisory bodies who work together. And the idea is that we can contribute and building awareness of rights issues in World Heritage and heritage management in general, that we promote good practice if possible, and that we can develop and recommend tools and guidelines for World Heritage. Now, let's move to the human rights chapter of my speech, and we are coming to the definitions, because we have been talking a lot about human rights-based approach and rights-based approaches, but what is it after all? Well, the human rights-based approach is a conceptual framework that is based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we can discuss whether it's universal or not, but not during the question time, because that would take too long. The idea is it's linked to promoting and protecting human rights, and it also offers a sustainability check to development, because neglect of human rights may negatively affect commitments to the goals of human development. Now, rights-based approaches is a little bit different in the sense that it seeks to integrate national and international rights, norms, standards, and principles into policy and practice, and from planning to assessment. Rights-based approaches are built upon the identification of rights and duties, of the recognition of rights holders and duty bearers, and those 2 notions are actually different from stakeholders. Now, all rights-based approaches and frameworks aim at ensuring that they support rights, and even if there is a almost universal adoption of the concept, there's no international agreed definition or just one approach, and that's the reason why we always speak to them in plural. But I think that I made a mistake in my PowerPoint, and somewhere there is still rights-based approach in singular. So what's the difference now with participatory approaches? This is also linked to the influence of the Faro Convention of the Council of Europe that I mentioned already, and that identified heritage communities, democratic participation in all aspects of heritage conservation, from the identification to the access and the enjoyment. I would also like to mention one important, the important reports by the UN Special Rapporteurs on Cultural Rights, especially the first 2 rapporteurs, Farida Shahid and Karima Benoun, who promoted access to and enjoyment of cultural heritage and looked into issues of international destructions of cultural heritage, which I already mentioned. The current mandate holder is Alexandra Xantaki, and she is looking into issues linked to cultural rights and migration, which is also a topic I think that is of interest in your conference. So what do rights-based approaches mean in terms of World Heritage? Well, also here we seek to integrate norms, standards, and principles into policy, operational guidelines, and to identify enabling factors. Now, allow me also to draw your attention that to respect human rights means simply not to interfere with their enjoyment. Protecting human rights means to take steps to ensure that third parties do not interfere with their enjoyment. But fulfilling human rights is a step further, and that means to take steps progressively to realize the rights in question. So there are some benefits and lessons that we learned in ICOMOS and IUCN and ICROM from this Our Common Dignity initiatives. It's that it offers standards for processes, for instance, for consultations. We have a definition of duty bearers and rights holders. And when in the World Heritage arena, duty bearers is always the state party, or the representatives of the state party. And I welcome the person who will speak next after me. Rights holders are those who have rights related to World Heritage. Right holders may be individuals or who have formal and informal rights, but it can also be groups of people, interest organizations and NGOs. Stakeholders normally have a contractual or reciprocal contract with the duty bearer. And this is not always the case with rights holders. And thus rights holders might be more vulnerable, or it might be more challenging to include them. So ultimately also what we learned is that it offers more well-being and better conservation. In the middle of the slide, you see a couple of publications that were made by the Our Common Dignity Initiative and the working group of ICOMOS. In the middle is the Taking Stock in publication made in 2017. And this Taking Stock publications, in fact, identified 3 scenarios for the future. We could stay with the operational guidelines of the World Heritage as they were, so the status quo. We could work towards creating a common rights framework, or at least work towards that. And the next step would be to enable actions and capacity building, so to invest there. Now, the good news is that the status quo is already out. We are working towards that common rights framework, because the last amendments of the operational guidelines for implementing the World Heritage Convention has already introduced a lot of concepts that we think are important. But there was actually, let's say, a dream by Amund Sinding Larsen and the colleagues who initiated this whole work within ICOMOS, and together with IUCN and ICROM. It's in addition to the 10 criteria for the outstanding universal value, in addition to the requirements of authenticity for cultural sites and integrity for cultural and natural or mixed sites. And in addition to the protection and management requirements, to have also a requirement for human rights and social equity. So now we are really in the middle of the work. Let's dive into World Heritage. And so it's not surprising, you have seen that I've done that before, but I copied some paragraphs of the preamble of the World Heritage Convention, showing that, again, all the peoples of the world and mankind as a whole were at the center. So it's people-centered as well, even if it's a site-based convention. Now, of course, there are many challenges for World Heritage, and I do apologize because I combined almost in one single slide something that could be a conference for several days. There are far more challenges in World Heritage sites than the ones that I have listed. But again, I want to draw your attention to some of them. The first one, that pristine natural sites do exist, but they are very rare. In most sites, even in natural sites, you have people living. In the very first nominations and inscriptions on the World Heritage List from, for instance, Africa, the people who lived there were not taken into account. And it was also because of the concept of national parks, where people were moved out of the park, that was at the time let's say was used as a concept. Nowadays we are very far from that, and we take into account that heritage is living heritage and that people are living there. As I said, it's our daily life environment. Not enough attention was paid to the indigenous peoples. The very first nominations were top-down nominations developed by the state parties. Nowadays, we see that the initiatives for World Heritage nominations are taken by cities or by regions, and that they see it as we are moving from an object nomination to a project for development of a region or of a town. And then, of course, another challenge is the lack of involvement and participation of communities, where we see that even after a few years of being on the World Heritage List, because of this lack of involvement and participation, the site comes back for discussion at the World Heritage Committee sessions as a state of conservation report, because there are unsympathetic developments. Now, are there some responses? Yes, of course, there are even more than one. Again, I have only listed a few of them, and actually the most recent ones. The first thing that I absolutely wanted to mention is that ICOMOS, in its assessments, in the evaluations of World Heritage sites, cultural heritage sites, has always taken into account that those places are places where people live. And this has even been made explicit since 27. Why is 27? Because it was easier, because then the nomination format was changed. But ICOMOS really discussed this at length in its World Heritage panel. A milestone in World Heritage and human rights was the World Heritage Policy on Sustainability, adopted in 2015, where for the first time we saw wording of linked to rights. And the inclusion of rights and community involvement happened after that in the with the amendment of the operational guidelines in 2019 and 2021. I will come to that into detail, because there are new requirements for those nominations, and Clara actually already read out part of that text. However, I wanted also to make a reference to the recent decision of the World Heritage Committee on how to handle heritage of conflicts. And it started as a discussion and let's say, heritage that is contested, or heritage that is linked to wars. And I have to admit that the discussion was triggered by the nomination by Belgium and France of the cemeteries and memorials of World War I. And of course, those Belgium and France had made a very conscious choice not to choose, let's say, the battlefields, but the cemetery and the memorials. And they thought, but maybe it was not well expressed in the nominations, but for them, those cemeteries where you have people from all over the world and from all sides of the conflict, they show the barbarity of war. And when you come on those sites, you just feel it physically. And so the two countries thought that it was in line with the peace mission of UNESCO. Now we are living in a war again, and the World Heritage Committee in the beginning of this year has made a decision on this, this heritage. But what is interesting, not yet on that nomination, that is for the end of the year. But what is important is that they have developed a mechanism where there's place for dialogue, time for dialogue. Time must be taken for dialogue and dialogue between people who do not agree. So you see on the left, the basic text, which is a publication that combines the convention, the rules of procedure, but also the operation guidelines. To the right, you have the operation guidelines when you download them from the web. Always check that you have the latest version. I cannot underline that enough. And actually what we will be looking at are the annexes 3 and the annex 5 in particular. But I also wanted to say that there is another new thing. It's that there will be a two-step nomination process, which will be compulsory from 2028 onwards, and where the human rights-based approach is even more, let's say, present. The first line that you see on the screen, state parties are encouraged to prepare a tentative list. So preparing tentative list, that has not changed, but the states are now encouraged to do that with after consultation with stakeholders and right holders, and to obtain free, prior and informed consent. Now, the new thing is that there is a kind of preliminary assessment to ensure that countries will not dive into year-long preparations of nominations that actually do not have a big chance of success. And there, this should also involve the appropriate stakeholders and right holders. And the format for that request is the famous Annex 3. And now the nominations have also to take into account, and that's actually the paragraph I think that Clara read out this morning. And the request format is in Annex 5. So this is an extract. You see here, what I wanted to show was the paragraph 12, because there you see the kind of wording that is used. We are very proud of that wording. We are happy with that wording, even if it's maybe a very, let's say, maybe it's jargon of international organizations, but at least people can work with that. It makes a difference for people working on the spot. Now, here, this is the new annex, the format for nominations, and what is particularly important are the section 5A. With a section for the indigenous peoples and a section on participation. And here I wanted also to inform you that actually ICOMOS has not waited for this new format to be used and then see how are we going to deal with this new information that we receive, which is far more, which is better formatted than it was in the past. Because even if I mentioned that ICOMOS took into account the involvement of population and the fact that people were living in the place, in the nomination file, there was not always a lot of information available, and that will change. And to prepare those assessments, ICOMOS has conducted a pilot scheme for screening by desk reviews, right issues in World Heritage dossier. So we work with a kind of questionnaire, but we haven't had the feedback yet from this pilot project, but that will happen very soon. So ICOMOS, I would say, is ready to go. And this is then the Annex 7. with the format for the preliminary assessment. So even when in the future state parties will request a preliminary assessment, they will already have to provide information on the involvement of the people. So that's fine for nominations, but we tend to forget that it's not only about nominations. An inscription on the World Heritage List is not an end, but a beginning. And it's management of the sites on the World Heritage List and on the list of World Heritage in Danger that is equally important. And there was a workshop already in almost 10 years ago, organized by the 3 advisory bodies in Oslo about that. So could rights-based approaches and participatory approaches be a response to the global and societal challenges? Maybe not the unique response, but it will certainly help, I think, to open the dialogue. So in conclusion, I would say that rights-based approaches are key to sustainable development and to the dignity of the people involved, hence the importance of dialogue and building bridges, something that the UK is known for, and there are bridges on your World Heritage List, UK bridges on the World Heritage List. I would like to conclude by thanking ICOMOS-UK and its partners for offering this opportunity and organizing this conference. Thank you so much.
I will try and keep this quick. Hello online, you can see me. I'm going to try and sort of do a bit of background explanation, really. People often ask for the perspective of DCMS, or can we have government's view? It's quite difficult to easily give that, and so I wanted to kind of explain why, really. It will also, in a way, hopefully answer some of the questions about particularly when people say government should do X or Y or Z. I received 3 letters yesterday. It was an excellent day for me, from various people saying government should be doing X, or minister, you should be doing Y, which was slightly depressing because I have to write the response for all of them, and the responses are not going to be they're not going to answer or give everyone the answers that they wanted. So there is rarely a single government position on anything. That's worth just saying as a kind of to start with. Most government positions are through ministers. Ministers do the interviews, they do the media, they kind of approve all the publications. Officials don't do interviews. I'm speaking to you as a panelist, not a media interview. I googled this last night. I've been in DCMS 5 years. I've had 4 prime ministers and now 8 secretary of states. Not hugely helpful, and you can imagine that that changes. I mean, obviously all within the same party, but still a considerable amount of change and different views. So just very briefly, how do we get to a sort of official view, or how do we get to minister's view? It starts with the policy officials. So someone like me, I basically am sort of tasked with doing the first drafting whatever needs to be said or published. I am not an expert. I'm certainly not a heritage expert. I'm certainly not a distinguished academic, doctor, or anything like that. I'm more of a kind of generalist. So I will generally start by kind of referencing all of those kind of experts. For DCMS, Historic England and Joint Nature Conservation Committee are our statutory advisors on cultural and natural heritage. I will look to UNESCO guidelines, operational guidelines, as we've already mentioned. I'd look to things like Moss's Our Common Dignity work. UK National Commission for UNESCO, which is the sort of policy lead that sits in the UK with UNESCO. There was a recent report, reducing inequalities and decolonising heritage practices, people-centred approaches, that had some very interesting recommendations in it. And then more widely, just things like the National Lottery Heritage Fund's principles for their recent strategy. You might have seen principles supporting greater inclusion, diversity, access and participation in heritage, all kind of publicly available stuff. I might also come to conferences like this and learn more and listen more. So I would produce a first draft that would then go to legal colleagues. It may go to finance colleagues if there's a finance aspect. It may go to other sort of departments. I work within a cultural diplomacy team. I work separately to the domestic heritage team. We also work separately to the museums and cultural property team. Don't ask me why, that's just how it's kind of ended up. But we try not to be too siloed. I then have to take that through senior civil servants, so they will look at it, comment, clear. They have obviously a wider view of the department and what's going on in government, so they kind of meant to make sure that all connects along the lines. Then it will probably go via special advisors or SPADs. These are the kind of advisors to ministers that are not officially, they're not civil servants. They will take a view on a kind of political context. Then it will finally get to ministers. Ministers will comment. Also, if it's actually with it's actually sort of media, comms team will be involved as well. Ministers will comment. If it's particularly contentious, it will also go to number 10. Number 10 comms team will take a view. If it's publication, it would be normally you need to go for what's called a grid slot. So number 10 organise and approve all the announcements. And so just to make you aware that it's a big old kind of lot of steps to go through to get there. Why is it so complicated? Well, partly is a kind of core principle of collective responsibility, which is a kind of, it's basically, it's just, how do we describe it? It's basically a united front. So ministers take a united front and don't criticize each other. So once there's a policy, everyone agrees with that policy. And it's to ensure that you can have frank and honest discussions behind closed doors. It sounds kind of like less than ideal, but the reality is that if that didn't happen, then you have loads of people just disagreeing with each other in public. You're continually undermining, you'd be undermining kind of like arguably the sort of foundations of kind of how things work, and without making a on the record comment, you only need to look at Dominic Raab episodes in recent weeks for how that is pretty problematic for how the system works. But that's an unofficial view. So that's a kind of a point about government responsibility and kind of how they sort of work. I just want to make one point about government and state party and UNESCO, in that people often think, it's a kind of common misconception, particularly around World Heritage, that UNESCO have made it a World Heritage site, therefore UNESCO can do X, Y, Z. Well, it doesn't quite work like that, because it's a convention that, yes, UNESCO kind of made right, but all the state parties sign up to that convention, and they willingly sign up to the convention to say, we willingly will agree to all these kind of obligations and guidance, etc., etc. So the actual responsibility on World Heritage is devolved to the state party level. And so again, like these letters that I get, and please don't write me letters, will say, well, UNESCO must do this. Well, they can't, UNESCO doesn't have power to do that. We haven't, like, the government hasn't given power for UNESCO to do. The majority of these sort of, not the limit, but the maximum amount they can do is delist. But I'm certainly not having that conversation about Liverpool here today. You can talk to me about lunch if you want to hear my thoughts. Where was I? Yes, so UNESCO responsibility devolved to government, but similarly, where does government's role begin and end? in the UK, heritage is a devolved matter. So it means Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland all look after their heritage. But we sign UNESCO treaties as the UK. So the DCMS has a certain kind of role as state party for kind of making sure everyone's going in the right direction. And similarly, things like planning and local issues are looked after at a local level, so local authority. So sort of things like planning are devolved from national government to local government. So there's a kind of, it's not, I don't wish to sort of stand here and make excuses, but there is a sort of the degree of devolved responsibility down to the sites themselves. To someone's earlier question, it's kind of, it becomes a responsibility of the sites themselves. Now, that's not to say that government is saying, or DCMS is saying, you know, we're not involved in it, but that's kind of how it works. So just to quickly talk through, as an example, the tentative list process, which we've just been through. So if you're not familiar, every 10 years, so the tentative list is like a short list of sites that can be put forward to World Heritage nomination. State parties are encouraged to review them every 10 years. We've just done that. It was published on Easter Monday, hopefully you've seen. Got great press, I was very pleased about that. Most read article on BBC News website for the morning. It's very good. How do we approach it? We set up a steering group, or I set up a steering group of cross-government officials. So we made sure that all of the devolved administrations were represented, made sure all of the kind of relevant experts and heritage bodies were represented. And then we kind of referred to things like obviously the operational guidelines, but also the ICOMOS kind of guidance on reviewing tentative list, reports from the previous tentative list review 10 years ago, all these kind of things. We agreed on how we should run the process. That again then got signed off, went through that process again to kind of ministerial approval, make sure they're happy with the kind of general principles. We didn't send them all of the workings, but the kind of main kind of points is how we run it. Again, went through ministers. And generally we took a bottom-up approach. So not the kind of state just saying, we're going to pick this and this, but we did a call for applications. We ran some information sessions to kind of answer questions. We ran, we had an EOI stage. When people went through that, we then ran workshops to kind of further go through the application form and try and help people through the application. Could we have done more? Yes, that's a kind of a sort of point that's come out of it. We are I am looking at the sort of lessons learned from this review and how we can kind of improve things in the future. But we kind of there were various limitations at the time. And then we assembled a panel, an independent expert panel, to assess the bids. They were based on, assessment was based on the UNESCO criteria, the full nomination, which includes community representation and involvement. Then we kind of went through the process and made the final selection. Again, the minister makes the final selection. Hopefully you've seen, we had 5 sites, 2 natural, 1 overseas, 1 20th century history, 1 Stone Age history. It was quite an interesting selection. There were a number of factors that needed to be taken into consideration for what was selected, but we hope that it was a kind of fairly interesting and representative list. So I'm going to stop there. Hopefully that's been slightly helpful.
So as Will says, I am going to talk about community involvement, inclusive heritage and the Heritage Fund's 2033 strategy. But probably even just to preface this, it might be worth me just making a couple of points about Northern Ireland and how we engage with heritage here and its wider relevance to the whole issue of contested heritage. Northern Ireland is a divided society, and one of the things that at the Heritage Fund we've had to get our heads around is how do we encourage people to engage in heritage and speak at a community level in ways in which their stories can be told in an understandable and non-sectarian way. And that's not the most straightforward. It sort of engages with a lot of the issues around contested heritage, as you're finding out in the rest of the UK. But we've been able to navigate that space over the last decade and more. And one of the key things and one of the key ways of doing that has been able to sort of face into the past head on, not look for any qualified neutrality, but actually be prepared to allow people to speak with their own voices and on their own terms, but helping sort of people to understand that the language which is used has to be kind of understandable to different communities. So, I mean, I think there's, well, I could speak about that at great length at another time. There's a lot to be learned from the Northern Ireland context, and certainly from the Heritage Fund's perspective, a lot of that learning is being sort of pushed out beyond Northern Ireland and into all of our work. So, I mean, it probably goes without saying, but we are the largest funder of heritage on these islands, and we've awarded over 8 billion to about 44,000 projects across the length and breadth of the UK, and we've been about since 1994. And really, it was from about 1999 when government policy very much sort of pushed us into the area of recognizing that heritage needs to be able to inform and educate and engage with people at a community level. And that has been at the total heart of everything that we have done to date. And the case studies that I'm going to touch on hopefully will bring out those points, and there are projects that we've been working on in the context of Northern Ireland over the last 15 and more years. And it's that heritage doesn't mean anything unless you're thinking about how it connects with people and communities. And that is a fundamental point, and the wider impact that heritage always has to be fully understood. And I mean, that's why one of the terms I would use quite a lot is this idea of inclusive heritage. And inclusive heritage is heritage which is prepared to tell all the very different and varied stories that we have, reflect all the perspectives that there are, not necessarily at the same time, because that would be impossible, but also to be heritage which is framed in a way that can engage with people, whoever they are. All of that is fundamentally important. So the first project I'm going to mention is the Giant's Causeway. Now, I was involved 2 decades ago. I was working for the National Trust, and one of my first tasks was, after the visitor facilities were burnt down in the year 2000, one of my first tasks was to set in course the process towards rebuilding new visitor facilities. But I had an even greater pleasure as well when I was asked to produce the first World Heritage Site Management Plan for the Giant's Causeway. And that I think has been one of the most sort of interesting things that I've ever been involved in. One of the key challenges at the Giant's Causeway, I mean, here you've got a site which was getting nearly 500,000 people a year. And so you've got a lot of pressures, landscape pressures, you've got heritage pressures in terms of how the site connected into the wider community. And the production of the World Heritage Site Plan helped us think through some of those particular issues. But back to the contested heritage bit that I mentioned, Northern Ireland at that point in time was still in the first few years after the Good Friday Agreement, and that we were starting to see a great increase in tourism. But some of the side effects of that were difficult to fully anticipate. One of the issues that we found, certainly at the National Trust at that point in time, up at the Giant's Causeway, was that some buses and sometimes some cars that were coming through the nearby village of Bushmills were attacked because they had license plates from the south of Ireland, and that kind of reflected the uneasy sort of issue between communities, tourism, and the wider potential benefits of a site like the Giant's Causeway. By the time that I started to work for the Heritage Fund in 2006, a process which I had initially put in place myself, but then was taken on by others, a process of looking to Heritage Fund, looking to produce a Heritage Fund application to reimagine the visitor facilities and put a more integrated approach in place was already ongoing. And that issue of where that local community was and what the National Trust wanted to achieve had to be resolved through this particular application. And the principles that we were operating under them, and are really no different now, sort of ensured that we challenged the National Trust all the way through to engage with that local community, so that they would actually start to see the real benefits of the potential of the development of new facilities at the World Heritage Site. So community engagement officers, dedicated community engagement officers were put in place to build a series of programs of working with the community, engaging with the local community, and encouraging volunteers from that community. Also looking at the National Trust shop and ensuring that local produce was in display there and was sourced. All of those things were more or less became conditions of Heritage Fund funding for new visitor facilities. And you can see from the images, what was ultimately achieved is very striking. A building which echoes the stones themselves. And certainly in those early years, we were very, very pleased with the National Trust's response to the challenges which I've outlined. And it became, if you go to Bushmills today, you will see a much better relationship between the community and the visitors that come there. And certainly I'm not sure of the figures of this moment in time, but certainly in those early years, many people from the local community were employed as part of the enhancement of the overall site. So today, it's probably one of the biggest cash cows within the National Trust UK-wide. 1 million people a year go to that site, which is 200 to 300% greater than with the previous facilities. But essentially, working with the community was fundamental. Clearly, it was something that was called for through the World Heritage Site Management Plan, and it was a challenge that the National Trust were able to positively respond to. And the sense of communities being as equal partners is incredibly important. Second example I'm going to talk about is Hillsborough Castle. Now, Hillsborough Castle is the only royal site that we have in Northern Ireland. So whenever any of the royal family come over, they stay there. It's also the home of the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland when he or she is there. And one of the challenges, again, looking at it through the prism of the contested past that we have in Northern Ireland, a royal site was not something that necessarily spoke to everyone in the community, because you have a substantial number of people in Northern Ireland who want to break the link with the United Kingdom. So one of the challenges whenever, from a Heritage Fund perspective, whenever we were faced with discussing with historic royal palaces what an application would look like, and what a successful project would need to achieve, one of the first challenges we put to them is that their project needed to find a way to speak to the whole community of Northern Ireland. So it needed to speak to nationalists, Republicans, as well as Unionists and Loyalists. And you might think, being a royal site, that in itself would have been a challenge. But one of the key things about this building and about the history that was contained within this building was that it had played a very important part over decades in the evolution of the peace process. It was a building where huddled meetings, quiet meetings out of sight of the cameras were held, and the Secretary of States throughout the Troubles would have invited various players in the conflict in Northern Ireland to the castle and engage with them to help move the peace process forward. And then when it came to the Good Friday Agreement, a number of significant meetings were held here. So in terms of an application to ourselves, we wanted the story that should be told. And it was, as I say, it wasn't, it didn't come initially from historic royal palaces, because they were very focused on that sort of royal castle and royal link element to it all. But our challenge to them was to bring out these other narratives, to bring out these other stories. And it certainly was something that historic royal palaces really positively engaged with. And if you go to Hillsborough Castle now, you'll see interpretation which will reflect a lot of that more hidden stories and pasts. But also, it was a delight for me just before sort of COVID started to be invited to speak at a conference which was held on LGBT plus issues at the castle. And I hadn't been aware myself of the wider connections to the whole LGBT history, but it's one of the most popular tours that you can go, is that the LGBT side of Hillsborough Castle and the connections to previous people who lived there, but also stories reflected in the paintings in the rooms and whatever. But a lot of this shows how you can bring out so many different dimensions to a place to make it appeal to communities, and certainly as well historic royal palaces, recognizing the impact of opening such a site to the general public, worked very closely with the community at Hillsborough to ensure that greater visitor numbers, greater numbers of cars and whatever could all be sort of managed in a positive and successful way. Right, my next example is the city cemetery in Belfast. And cemeteries, as you'll all know, tell amazing stories through the people that can be found buried there. And City Cemetery Belfast is no different at all. It was established in the 1860s, but again reflected this rather sort of challenge and sadly sort of sectarian past that Northern Ireland has. When the cemetery was established, there is an underground wall that separates Catholics from Protestants. It's quite ludicrous when you think of it today. But again, when the Belfast City Council came to us about this project, their real desire was to open this up to all of the people in Belfast. The city cemetery is currently at the heart of Republican West Belfast. And while it is mainly a Protestant cemetery and contains the graves of some of the most important people of the 19th century, great industrialists like Harland and Wolfe, and many of the people associated with the shipyards in Belfast, the architect of the Titanic, and many others. Being located in Republican West Belfast, it was kind of cut off from many people from a Protestant Unionist loyalist background in Belfast. But one of the things that had changed in recent years was there a new kind of tram type bus had been developed that would go from east to west Belfast, and that created a really good opportunity for people from Protestant East Belfast to come to West Belfast and see this particular cemetery. Again, we worked with the council to ensure that their development of this particular these visitors facilities and the wider work that was being done in the cemetery was very much rooted in their connections with local communities. The amount of consultation that is required from communities or from the likes of our applicants, whether it be Belfast City Council, Historic Royal Palaces, and others, is extensive. They really need to show how that they've connected in with local communities, how they're listening to local communities, how they're responding to those particular requests. And while this is very much Northern Ireland focused, this is how we operate UK-wide. We are not interested in projects which are deaf to the voices of local communities, but we also challenge projects to ensure that they broaden and they deepen the audiences that they already have. Too often we see people applying to us, and it's very clear to us that they only want to speak to the people that they've always spoken to. That's not of interest to us, and we challenge them every time our engagement teams speak to them. How are you going to bring in wider audiences? Have you thought about these groups of people? Have you thought of that groups of people? How do you embed the whole idea of inclusion into every aspect of what you do? That's essential to us as an organization. And the City Cemetery project will be opening, well, it is open, but the full work will be completed in the next month or two. One particular sort of problem had been there's a particular part of the cemetery that locals had been using in not the best of ways, and they had been railed off. But the work that has been done as part of our funding is opening up all of that space. And through what we expect is that through the engagement and the conversations that have been going on with local communities, that will not see the degrees of vandalism that would have happened in the past. So those are the three examples that I was going to give. I've also been asked to briefly talk about our new strategy. Heritage, it's entitled Heritage 2033. And it's a 10-year vision for heritage. everything you'll see within it is in many ways what we've always done and what we've always sought to do. But we hope will make it easier and clearer for people to be able to apply to us and to be able to understand what is asked of us. And it was great to hear from the DCMS speaker just before now. And we recognise that over the next 10 years, we'll probably be putting another nearly 4 billion into the UK's heritage. That's an incredible responsibility. And what we're endeavouring to do is to be as clear as possible so that people can think strategically. And that is the key point there. Everything that we do should be strategic. And when people come to us, we recognize if you're going to spend 4 billion, you want to have outcomes that really are truly meaningful. And that's what this strategy is setting out to do. So we developed 4 investment principles: saving heritage, protecting the environment, inclusion, access and participation, and organizational sustainability. They all are equally important, but we recognize for different projects there might be different manifestations of emphasis on these that you would that would be reflected in what they're endeavoring to do. Saving heritage, to go into that a little bit, again, improving the condition and understanding of heritage. That point, it's not just about investing in a building to bring it back to how it was. There's embodied memory in our buildings, the stories behind buildings. Those intangible aspects of heritage are equally important. Achieving the point about reducing heritage at risk UK-wide, extremely important. Thinking about transformational long-term projects. That's what a 10-year strategy is all about. Recognizing the digital element to all of this. When it comes to protecting the environment, so we're not just about built heritage, we're about landscape as well, and the natural heritage that surrounds us. So increased understanding of and connection to nature, reducing the environmental impact of our funding portfolio. Again, with climate change, and going to spend 4 million, we will be asking projects to really build all of that into their thinking. And the challenge of climate is also about how climate change impacts on projects as well. On the organizational side, again, it's funding organizations that are sustainable and helping them to sort of build better revenue streams. Skills are incredibly important within organizations, but also the skills for heritage as well, and building that organizational resilience into everything, and so that there is those wider economic benefits there. But the area of greatest importance, I think, for many of us, and certainly for this conference today, the idea of inclusion, access and participation. Again, we're reaffirming that is fundamental to all that we do. So increased diversity of heritage workforces and audiences, challenging ourselves to understand, as Dan was talking earlier about our own privilege and the voices that we speak for, reducing barriers for people who are underserved by heritage, enabling more people's heritage to be recognised, and championing against digital technology to improve access. All of that is so fundamentally important, and hopefully some of the examples that I gave earlier will sort of give some light to that. So in terms of how we deliver all of that, our open programs are continuing, and this is where our local committees are of great importance. and they will be making most of the decisions, both for small grants and larger grants. But we're also going to be looking at certain strategic interventions. So, for example, it's very likely that there will be a landscape scheme announced next year. We're already looking at placemaking, and we're hoping to identify over 20 sort of sites UK-wide to invest over the 10-year period in that consistent and continued way. But working with partnership, we're not, we're just one element of the heritage ecology. So working with groups who can really get to areas and get to communities that would otherwise be very, very difficult. Partnerships, we're really sort of open and welcome for that. And this wider focus on place, landscape, nature and heritage in need and responding to opportunities and emergencies. We've learned through COVID, things, nothing stays the same. You've got to be sort of ready and open to what happens next. So really, hopefully that gives you a bit of a picture. In a short period of time, there is so much to say, but so little time in which to say it. But we're very much see ourselves as partner with all of you out there. We will work in partnership with you to achieve the aims and successful sort of spending of the lottery money, which we are so lucky to have. So thank you very much indeed. That's me, and I'll pass you back to the chair.
So you might notice I've got a question mark here after rights-based approach. This is because actually is a rights-based approach if we're looking at the law. Does that answer our questions? I started life doing pure and applied biology, occasionally escaping to the Pitt Rivers Museum, realizing we needed some culture as well. I then moved, realizing people wouldn't look after the environment unless they made money, read natural resource economics and disappeared to Southeast Asia doing national park management plans, and realized there in the middle of Indonesian Borneo that unless the communities there had rights, they were actually going to be shipped out of those national parks by the government conservation organizations. And that's when I started getting interested in the law and moved into that work. And my work really brings those sort of cross-disciplinary issues together. So, there is no silver bullet, as has been said earlier. So the Lake District is a World Heritage Site. It took a very long time to get inscribed, but it is now. Its outstanding universal value is rooted in a persistent and distinctive agro-pastoral farming system. For those of us from the Lake District, this means commoning and hill farming. It's a techie word. So you can see in this picture, you've got the Herdwick sheep, you've got the farmer, and you've got the landscape of the intricate valley bottoms, the greener bits in the middle of the picture going up into what's called allotments and onto the open fells. So it's this mosaic, this jigsaw of the landscape that has been the natural beauty, having been shaped by the farming system over many centuries, if not millennia. So this talk is all about, we've heard before about rights, responsibilities and duties, and how do these interact? And this is where it's really important to think. It's very easy to talk about a rights-based approach. Giving effect to it is very, very difficult. Any prizes here for who knows the man who's walking along checking the sheep? This will show whether any people are connected with the natural heritage as well as the cultural heritage of World Heritage Sites. So he's a chap called James Rebanks. Do look him up if you don't know about him. He's wrote his book, English Pastoral and the Shepherd's Life. He's been on Desert Island Discs and Private Passions. He's one of our great sort of well-known, what I call modern celebrities of the Lake District, hill farmer and a writer who happens to have a double first in history. So when we think about how do the farming communities of the Lake District, of which there are 500 farming families who are effectively looking after the Lake District, they are working in an incredibly complex environment. And I apologize if I speak really fast, but there's quite a lot to get through. And I know everyone's really keen to have their lunch. So this is I'm really into maps. Having qualified as a chartered surveyor, I'm very into how do we use maps in order to show information. Maps are also great. You know, what's on the map is also really political and really contested. But here is the dark green is the boundary of the national park, which is the same as the boundary of the World Heritage Site. And the light green are sites of special scientific interest. So what we're talking about here is how do these different statutory and non-statutory obligations and duties interact. So you can see this is the Northern Lake District. So this is sort of Keswick northwards, and how do these interact? So that's complex in itself, but then it gets even more complicated. We now have a lot of that light green is actually orange, and that orange is common land. For those of you who don't know about common land, over half of England was common land until the early 17th century, at which point we had the appropriation of land for the purposes of agricultural improvement. We had the enclosure of the commons. Some those of you who come from more literary background might know the work of John Clara. And we have the issues whereby we are now only have 3% of England is common land. So we've gone from 50% to 3%. So as a heritage, it is massively at risk. A third of all common land is in Cumbria, and it's 28% of the national park is designated common land, and commoners, those 500 farmers, farmers, they manage over half the Lake District. So here we have this first challenge, is that it is we have a multi-layered legal designations over one piece of land. And we have communities who are running incredibly marginal businesses, many relying on tax credits, etc., to keep going. They currently earn about £4.30 an hour for the work that they do, delivering a site that brings in £2 billion a year to the community and to the county, and we have 20 million visitors a year. It's very, very complex, and it is the people at the bottom who are in effect delivering the site that we all value so much. So I'm going to look at rights, responsibilities and duties through two particular lenses. First, the lens of the commoners, and secondly, the lens of the National Park Authority, and it's the Lake District National Park Partnership that has the responsibility for delivering the World Heritage Site Management Plan. So firstly, looking at rights of common. So a right of common is, it's got a wonderful word, incorporeal hereditament, which is just fantastic. I felt really proud when I learned that. So it is a right, it is a legal right, and it is classed as land under the Law of Property Act, but it doesn't exist in soil. So it's incorporeal, you can't physically hold on to it, but it is a right for someone to graze their livestock on a piece of land. Now, the only right the commoner has is for their animals to take the grass with the animal's mouth. So the commoner can't go along and scythe it and take away the grass. They have to turn out their animals in order to graze. So your rights are under the Commons Registration Act in 1965. That was the first time they were put into statute. Those rights are quantified and by the number of stock you can turn out. So that sounds great. I've got the right for 200 sheep. Susan might have the right for 500 sheep. Someone else will have the right for 2 ponies, someone else for a few cows or geese. And that sounds great. And that's what the commoners think their legal right is, to graze those livestock. But actually, those rights are totally and utterly constrained in the majority of cases by the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981 as amended, and in particular, Section 28E. This is really important. So is that you can't actually graze your livestock unless you have consent from Natural England, because the majority of common land is designated as sites of special scientific interest. So we have things called ORNICs, operations requiring Natural England consent. And the operation as listed in the notification of the SSSI, and this is a statute, this Natural England have a duty. It's not just they are able to look after these sites, they have a duty to do that. I was on the board of Natural England and chaired their Uplands Committee for 5 years. I'm not any longer on the board of Natural England, but I have familiarity with that work. So the operation as listed for the whole of the Lake District is grazing, the introduction of grazing and changes in the grazing regime. All of those require consent. So that means you literally cannot put one animal out on the mountain, on the common, unless you have consent from the government to do so. This means, in effect, your rights are massively and utterly constrained. We'll come back to that in a moment. Moving on to the World Heritage Site. So the legal status, this is taken, from government website, probably from Heritage England. I think the designation of a World Heritage Site by UNESCO brings no additional statutory controls, but protection is afforded through the planning system as well as through other designations. Now, this just shows in rural and landscape sites that the whole statutory system is totally ill-equipped to handle World Heritage Sites because the planning system has no management control over the grazing of land. So we have World Heritage Sites really have no legal effect in the Lake District. They have no legal controls. They offer no protection in terms of looking after the cultural heritage. There may be some cross-checks, there may be some what we would call heritage impact assessments done, but overall the consents for grazing, to looking after the World Heritage Site, they have no legal status there, because actually if we look at the World Heritage, the Wildlife and Countryside Act, this is another, Section 28 is really important to the Wildlife and Countryside Act. Section 28G says, and this is not from the Act, but this is from a KC's opinion that we got recently. Section 28G of the Wildlife and Countryside Act imposes a general duty on the Lake District National Park Authority when exercising functions which are likely to affect SSSIs to take reasonable steps consistent with the proper exercise of the authority's functions. This is because national park authorities are public bodies and have what's called a Section 40 NERC duty to deliver for biodiversity. And these sites are not only sites of special scientific interest, but they're special areas of conservation which have even greater legal protection. So the National Park Authority has a duty to protect these sites for biodiversity. It also has, it's signed up to the World Heritage Site, but its duties in most cases will trump its World Heritage Site desires. So it is quite complex. It's a little bit, in fact, this is the next thing. It is really complex. So that says rights in the Lake District underneath the Zoom bit. So we have, if we look at a common through the lens of a commoner, we have the commoners, we have the landowners who have many different interests there. We have the DEFRA family, the Rural Payments Agency, we have Natural England, we then have the National Park, and that's really how schemes on commons. So the way most commons are managed are through schemes that the government pays money to commoners through stewardship schemes. We then have national legislation, and then we have the NGOs who are hugely influential in this. And in fact, at the time of the inscription, when that was going through, a letter was issued by several conservation organisations at the time of the inscription saying that they felt that the World Heritage Site was a massive threat to the biodiversity of the Lake District. It's been contested the whole way through and remains so. If you want to follow the Twitter accounts of Ben Goldsmith or George Monbiot, you can hear more. So I'm, as a sort of I dabble in the academia. I think it's fair to say my PhD was around legal pluralism and the governance of national parks, how they can deliver ecosystem services. And I'm particularly interested in how do we make sense of this chaos. So when we look at what we call legal orders, there are lots of different legal orders, and it's quite helpful to unpack this, I find. So we look at state legal systems, they are positive. The key about positive legal systems is that they're not positive at all. They're simply things they don't have an outcome. You follow the law irrespective of the outcome. So you might hear people saying the law is an ass, because that is because the law doesn't have an outcome. You just follow what the law is. And that's why many judges are constrained in what decisions they come to. So we have state legal systems, we have customary or traditional law, really important in the management of commons. We have economic norms, so we have what are the pressures on farmers, the price of fertilizer goes up, there's, it's Eid and the price of lamb goes up, all sorts of things happen. And then we have these functional agreements, and the main tool for delivering the World Heritage Site outcomes in the Lake District is stewardship schemes. And then we have community and cultural obligations. Sense of identity is absolutely critical here. So farmers have the most enormous sense of identity and commitment to farming. They consider themselves as food producers, even though all lamb that's eaten in England only comprises 2% of the UK's average adult diet, and all beef imported or homegrown is only 6%. But from the farmer's sense of identity, they are a food producer. And this is really critical if we're talking about change. And I should say, amongst all of this, I'm hugely committed to delivering on our biodiversity and climate crises. I was at the big one yesterday, standing outside Parliament. So this is not about biodiversity and climate or cultural heritage. It's about both. And I know cakeism has gone out of fashion with our previous Prime Minister, but I would still say I'm trying to be a cakeist here. I.e. have my cake and eat it. So looking at how these different normative orders interact, this was some work, and I produced this in 2014 when this is from my thesis. But what we're finding now is that green state legal system was quite small then, but we're now finding it's getting much, much bigger because government is committed to the 30 by 30 targets in terms of biodiversity. We do have a climate crisis that's becoming more and more urgent, and people are reaching to the law to resolve issues. And I would say that actually that's lazy, and it doesn't give the best possible outcomes. So a rights-based approach can sound attractive, but actually, is it right to use a rights-based approach? And I'm now going to come on to one of the issues around this. I will come on to alternatives, but very quickly, if we look at farm business income, we're talking about 500 farms, as I said, really marginal. The government has refused to look at the economic impact of their new policy as we've left Europe and are moving into an English agricultural system. But you can see here the green is the average farm business income. Doesn't matter what the figures are for the 3 years from 2019 to 22. The yellow is what's predicted by DEFRA for 2023, 22, 23, and the purple are the figures I've done. And what we're seeing is that from the green down to 2028, it's going to drop by 50%. So farm business income is expected to halve. And so that is where people are going to be earning less than £4 an hour. I would say that is wholly inappropriate, that we have very rich people in their very nice Cortexes and their large cars coming to the Lake District and enjoying a cultural heritage for people who are living in poverty. And if we're all comfortable with that, that's really disappointing. So as you can see, the main reason here is that the yellow bit of the bar graph has gone. So we're losing the yellow, which was the basic payment scheme, but we're not increasing the green bit, which is public payment for public goods. And this is because we're constrained by something called income foregone. We're not constrained. The policy of this government so far has been to pay on income foregone. If you're earning nothing and people ask you to do something else, then and they only pay you on what you were earning before, then there's no way that you're going to be able to have a better form of income. It is the opposite of levelling up. We are levelling down the Lake District. So what do we do if we're not going to sort of adopt a strict rights-based approach, because actually the rights aren't in favour of the farmers? Is that my view is that here, these two mules, and some of you may know this picture, the two mules both have a legal right to their own respective bits of hay, but they can't get there because it's just too difficult, it's too contested. So they keep on trying and they keep on trying and they keep on trying, and it's just a disaster. And in fact, they potentially, cause huge damage to each other as a result of that. So they have a little think, and then they say, well, if we do a bit of both, that's fine, we can get there. So they cooperate. So cooperation, not conflict, is the way we're looking to go forward. And here you'll see Susan sitting here in her very smart yellow jacket. And this was a meeting we called in 2019. And we had the Director General of the National Trust, we had the chair of the RSPB, we had the National Farmers Union, we had Natural England, and the patron of the Foundation for Common Land very kindly came currently to be crowned king in next weekend, I believe. And he's a huge advocate for cooperation, for getting people to work together. And as a result of this, we came up with a statement And this was under a project funded by the Heritage Fund. I apologize about using the old logo. I'm really, really sorry. It's the sort of thing the Heritage Fund get very, very upset about. And I have to eat my hat over that. But what we concluded was that we recognize this is a time of unprecedented change for both farming businesses and the environment. There is an urgency to address the risks from changes in farm economics, climate change, and biodiversity, and build resilience for the environment, farm businesses, and communities. And that thriving farm businesses and communities are central to the future success of a culture-rich and nature-rich landscape for the English Lake District. We are still having huge challenges, not just in the Lake District, in Dartmoor. You may have seen a lot in the press recently about Dartmoor. There was a debate in Parliament last week about it. It's really, really difficult making this happen in practice. It's the how we work rather than what we're doing is often the case. Today, I've had emails from the Regional Director of Natural England in covering Dartmoor. We are simply not allowing enough time to have these complicated discussions. We don't have clarity on rights and we don't have good communication. So that's a real whistle-stop tour. So apologize I've overrun, but I hope it gives you a flavour of the complexity of the work that the reality of giving effect to managing a World Heritage Site in the UK is. The parallels between World Heritage site, national parks and places in other parts of the world. I've worked a lot in Southeast Asia, are very, very similar. We can learn a lot from each other, but it gives you a little bit of a sort of insight into my world. And thank you very much for listening.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Clara, for inviting me to speak today. My name is Caitlin, and forgive me if I sound a bit nervous. I have a serious case of imposter syndrome being here right now. Yeah, I work for a small heritage consultancy in, I work for a small heritage consultancy called TDR Heritage, based in Shropshire in the West Midlands. And I've been lucky enough to work on projects with communities across the UK. I've worked with volunteer groups to record all unlisted heritage pubs in Bishop Wearmouth, in Sunderland and in Shropshire. I've worked as part of a team assessing nominations for the Black Country Local Heritage List. And at the moment, I'm working as a consultant project manager for both Buxton and Wednesbury High Street Heritage Action Zones alongside Historic England. I graduated from Birmingham City University with an MA in Conservation of the Historic Environment a couple of years ago now, and my thesis, By the People, for the People, which will form the basis of my presentation today, recently won the IHBC Gus Astley Award. So yes, forgive me, but this will be a whistle-stop tour of the flax mill so I can move on to how we measure community engagement to show its successes. So the flax mill is located in Shrewsbury, and it's widely recognised to be the world's first iron frame skyscraper. I think English Heritage first coined the moniker the grandfather of the modern skyscraper. It was designed by Charles Babbage in 1797 and was used for the production of flax into linen. It ceased production in 1851 because there were so many other mills across the country in places such as Leeds and Manchester, and then it became a maltings. It was also briefly used as a barracks in the Second World War, and then it returned back to a maltings until 1987, so there's still some living history on the site. However, since 1987, it's been empty and derelict and has fallen through several private owners' hands, each of them being unable to find a viable use for the site, which includes 8 separate buildings, each one of them listed. It's in 2004, Shropshire and Atcham Borough Council served a repair notice of approximately £1.8 million on the then owners, which set in turn a series of compulsory purchase orders. These discussions ended in about 2005, when the buildings were then acquired by Historic England. At this point, it was estimated that approximately £5 million worth of conservation repairs were needed, a figure which is somewhat of a dream now, considering it's just come in at about £28 million. So yeah, all 8 structures on the site, it is a massive site, and a massive amount of money has gone into it. So it has been funded by National Heritage Lottery Fund, Historic England, Shropshire Council, the Marches Local Enterprise Partnerships, with also donations from charitable trusts, foundations, individuals and local companies as well. So why did I want to look at this building? So I've lived in Shrewsbury my whole life, and this building is about 30 minutes walk away from my house. It's been derelict and dangerous ever since I can remember, and it has always been in scaffolding. And since I can remember, all 8 of the buildings on the site have been on the Heritage at Risk register. When I started my master's, I had a lecture from an architect who was working on the site at the time, who described the building's location as urban and edgy, which sort of rubbed me up the wrong way a little bit, because it is actually in the top 10% of most deprived wards in the country, and the top 20% locally as well. So urban and edgy is a bit of a stretch there. And then throughout my course, I had lectures from Historic England and SPAB, who were kind of promoting their scholars working on the site and really high status people. And then I was reading newspapers and I saw local businesses being demolished around the area. And you know, you go on social media and you see the community's comments about the site. And I just really started to wonder, so what are the local community getting out of this £20 million project? Because at the moment, everyone seems to be disillusioned with it. So yeah, here are some of the responses from the local community that were taken kind of throughout the project. So as I started looking at this, I posted surveys into the groups that these were taken from, so local Facebook groups, to kind of sort of suss out officially what people were thinking. There were differing opinions, which kind of made me think I need to quantify the success of this project. And at the time of writing, there was nothing that I could see that would allow me to do that. So I knew I needed to come up with a sort of success matrix in order to evaluate the project properly. So this is my success matrix. So like I said, I wanted to create a measurable tool which would help to prove my hypothesis that with conservation projects as large as this, the financial values may often be placed at a higher value than both the heritage values of the site and the community values, which ultimately results in the gentrification of an area and the disillusionment of the communities that would have ultimately and should have ultimately benefited. I wanted to quantifiably measure the successes of the project, because if you can't measure it, how can you improve it? I used example evaluation tools from organisations across the board, such as the Land Trust Alliance, the National Trust, and some from my own company that I work for, to kind of create a hybrid success matrix. However, please must note that this was written in a short space of time, and I would love to spend more time developing this in the future. I did find it really difficult when putting the matrix into practice, as you will see, to actually put numbers down, as not all goals can be measured. And I acknowledge this as a limitation of my findings. And yeah, I would love to continue researching it. So here is an example of the success matrix in practice. So I've just taken one of the goals from my thesis, which was more people and a wider audience from the local community will be engaged. So that was my goal. Why did I do this? Because the Index of Multiple Deprivation in 2015 revealed that the area where the Flaxmore located is a really deprived area nationally and locally. So a key aim should be to engage with these groups. And we all know these big reports, but the Heritage Counts 2018 report showed that social inclusion was considered to be one of the most significant barriers to engagement with heritage. And those people located in a higher deprivation area were less likely to engage with heritage. And yeah, so it just really hit the jackpot, really. The flax mill is located in a deprived area and a large amount of money is being spent on it. So that was my goal. So what needed to be changed or introduced to achieve that goal? So I looked at introducing free events specifically for a younger audience, and next to it are some of the things that were actually put into place throughout the project. So Christmas films were put on, and then next I did free events for the community as a whole. In my thesis I put a postcode bracket around it as well to really capture how the direct community were feeling. So this included kind of free hard hat tours, which were very popular. I think they're popular across all heritage sites actually. And free guided tours around the local community as well. So not just on the site of the flax mill, they did it around it so the community knew their local heritage. And then this was kind of written at a point with COVID as well. So how do we move online to capture more people online? And again, I think that removes another barrier. So some people might not feel as comfortable going to a site in person to have a free talk. So going online is sometimes a bit more accessible. And then reaching out to Black and ethnic minority communities as well. So they put in place placements, and there was a Polish women's project. We will come on to those too. So the evaluation / measurement, as I said, I found it incredibly difficult to quantify these goals, whilst you can put a number towards some of them. So there were 2 kind of film nights that were put in place, tick. That's only kind of half the problem, really. So yeah, the 2 girls who you see there, they are your Black and ethnic minority people that took the placement. One of them is myself, as you can see. Their attempts were really failed there. And I think that just kind of sums up their efforts in reaching out to the local community. You will have noticed in the previous slide, actually, if I go back, most of these events that were put on were by the Friends of the Flax Mill, not Historic England, who run the site. There's a couple, Historic England and the architects as well. Yeah, so all of these here are Friends of the Flax Mill. There were incredibly limited attempts from Historic England, and that Polish Women's Project never came to fruition either. So since writing my thesis, the Friends of the Flax Mill has actually closed down. Historic England's taken over that role. I'm sure it is far more nuanced than that article suggests it is, and Historic England had their reasons for it. But whatever the reason, I and many others have found this to be a great shame, as the Friends of the Flax Mill were the driving force behind any sort of community engagement. They were the shining star of my thesis, really, and they hit every box. They were the driving force behind the community involvement, engagement, and outreach. Planning has also been approved to build houses in front of the flax mill to try and balance some of the conservation deficits. This has always been the plan since the project started. However, due to lack of community engagement and involvement, it's now only coming out and revealing itself. So the community are quite enraged at that at the moment. That seems to be their go-to. And the community who have just seen the flax mill be restored after kind of a 10-year project are so disappointed to see houses going in front of it. And as we've said throughout, heritage doesn't really mean anything without the local community. So thank you.
Well, good afternoon. And I'm speaking from Edinburgh. And what I will do is to outline a little bit about my background, and I will then try to develop it into a history of, you know, what is going on at the moment in terms of looking at the history of slavery and its impact on the way we live now. Now, what is interesting is that, for example, you know, as we can see from the media, one of our MPs has some difficulties, and that I would say is related to a lack of understanding of the history of slavery and its relationship with racism. Now, if I start, as I said, with my own history, how should I begin? I was born in Jamaica in 1940. My mother and my father took me to live in Kingston, which is the capital of Jamaica. My father was a shoemaker, and he left the family in 1947. And we never saw him again, or my mother didn't, but I did. I met him again in New York in 1975. So he left in 1947, and I saw him again in 1975 when I was in New York giving a lecture on barley, which was my expertise then. And the reason how I saw him again, I think my mother must have told somebody in New York that his son was lecturing, and he turned up at the conference. And there were only two of us as Black people at the conference. Everybody else was white. And they were senior figures in the brewing industry worldwide. Again, I've mentioned that because this is a story that is not uncommon to people of my descent, where there are disruptions of that kind. And somebody will say to me, did not, you know, were you not upset by that? And I said, no, because basically those circumstances which I've just described was not unusual. Now, my mother left Jamaica in 1951, and she migrated to London as a young woman. And she sent for me, as the term is described, that your mother will send for you. That meant she left me with her sisters in Kingston, and they looked after me between 1951 and 55. And what did they do? They fed me, they clothed me, they sent me to school, but most importantly, they sent me to church. I attended church 3 times every Sunday, and that was almost compulsory. The impact or the influence of church on the people brought up in Jamaica, especially during my time, is a very significant part of their education. And I describe going to church as education. Now, in 1955, my mother sent for me, and my aunt packed me off with a small suitcase. And before I went, my grandaunt was a very tall, elegant lady, which nobody knew where she came from. But nevertheless, when she ordered you to do something, you did it. And my grandaunt called me over before I left on my trip to the UK in 1955. And she told me to take my shirt off, and she wrapped my chest in newspaper. And I put my shirt back on, and I never asked her why she did that. But it was obvious that she did that because she knew I was coming to London and I didn't have an overcoat. And therefore she wrapped me in newspaper to keep me warm. I left by plane, got to New York, got off at New York, and then I got a boat called the Ascania, which took me to Liverpool. And I arrived in Liverpool, I think it was the 3rd of March, 1955. And I had to get my way from Liverpool to Paddington, because that's where my mother was going to meet me. And I met my mother, and I didn't recognize her. She recognized me. And she took me home to North London, where she lived, not far from Pentonville Prison, where people were executed. That's where she lived. And she was taking me to work the next morning, because I didn't realize she brought me here to work. She was taking me to work, and there was a man at the door. And the man told my mother, when she was taking me to work, fortunately for me, there was a man at the door when she was exiting. And the man said to my mother, who is that? And she said, Godfrey Palmer, my son, he came yesterday. I'm taking him to work. And the man told her that I couldn't go to work because I wasn't 15 years of age. And I was very confused by all this, of course. But nevertheless, my mother had to take me to the local school in Islington. And the local school that she took me to designated me educationally subnormal, and gave me a piece of paper and told me to go to another school, which was Shelburne Road Secondary Mod, which was at Nag's Head in Islington. And I was taken not for the 1 month, but for a term, fortunately. And I was very good at cricket, and I got transferred to the grammar school because the grammar school headmaster said he needed a cricketer, because the word had got round that I was playing for London, even though I was in London only a couple of months. I was picked to play for the London schoolboys team. So that's how my real education began, with a man standing at the door insisting my mother could not take me to work. I had to go to school. Now, it's very important, that story, because when I've told it to various professionals in Scotland, what they've said is that in present day circumstances, somebody would have said to your mother, just keep him at home for the month, acting in a manner which was sympathetic, but nevertheless was not complying with the rules. And that is very important in terms of dealing with people like myself from the minority ethnic community, that people think they're trying to help us, but nevertheless could be working contrary to what is in our interest. Now, what I will do, because of time restraint and we started late, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. However, I left grammar school, went to work at Queen Elizabeth's College at London University, and Professor Chapman took me in as a junior laboratory technician. He helped me to get my O-levels and A-levels that I needed to get to university. But in 1961, so I started there in 1958, and by 1961, I had all the A-levels I needed and O-levels, but I couldn't get into a British university. And Professor Chapman, using a telephone, got me into Leicester University, and I got an honours degree at Leicester. I got an honours degree at Leicester University. I couldn't get a job in London. I got a job peeling potatoes. I was turned down for a master's by a very senior politician who told me to go home and grow bananas. That was in 1964. That's after I got an honours degree I was told to go home and grow bananas, and I told him that it was difficult to grow bananas in Haringey. I got an interview in Edinburgh at the Heriot-Watt to do a PhD, and I got my PhD from the Heriot-Watt College / Edinburgh University. I worked at both because the Heriot-Watt couldn't give PhDs then, they weren't a university. So my university was Edinburgh University, PhD. I left, went and worked in research at the Brewing Research Foundation, developed a process called barley abrasion, which changed the science of what was known about how barley is changed into malt. That's the scientific side. And the technological side is I developed a machine that abraded 10 tons of barley an hour. And between 1968 and 71, the large breweries in England were using the process, and in Scotland, to abrade barley. Bass Charrington's had 10 machines abrading 10 tons of barley an hour. So that's how effective the process was. I left the research institute, came back to the Heriot-Watt in 1977, and I stayed from 1977 to 2005, where I taught and did research. And the research I did was trying to develop the science and technology of cereals, which one example of its benefits is that I was the Guinness consultant and I had to go to Nigeria. And we changed the grain from using European grain, which the government banned, into using the local African grain, which was sorghum, which I'm now told is used all over Africa. And it's of great benefit to local small farmers who now have large companies, brewing companies all over Africa who use their grain. Now, I've told that story as quickly as I could, because what I'm trying to say, without the man at the door applying the rules and regulation without prejudice, even against my mother's interest, all what I told you would not have happened. And therefore, in terms of our system, it is not just the ability of individuals that can help them to progress in society. We're still at a stage that we need individuals. It's what Robert Burns called the goodness that mitigates woe. Without the individuals I met who helped me, like Professor Chapman, or the professor in Edinburgh who took me when I was rejected by the politician, then I would not be speaking to you. Now, what else has happened since then? Well, of course, since the death of George Floyd, we have had this great activity in looking at our, how we treat people, especially the descendants of people from British slavery. And one of the things about that slavery, it was legal. It was legal in that sense, it had to be abolished. And abolition, which was between 1833 and 1838, 1833, 1838, the slave owners got 20 million for their slaves because the slaves were property, legal property. And thus the slave owners got 20 million. It's 20 billion today. And therefore, that's a critical part of the history of our slavery. It's legality, where people were reduced to property. And therefore, that has instilled prejudices in people's minds, where that prejudice actually limits Black people, in fact, managing our society. And an example of that is our local health service up here, one particular sector had found that they only had 4 BAME managers from the nursing staff, and I was asked to help to try and change that. And we set up training courses and used the concept which I developed called, we're looking at improving an understanding of expectations within our society, because I felt that one of the limitations is people really do not understand what is expected of them. Both the people who are being interviewed and the people who are conducting the interview. And we actually set that course up, and within 3 years, we went from 4 managers to nearly 25. And therefore that showed it had nothing to do with expertise. It had to do with social aspects of understanding in our society. Now, while I was involved in that, as I said, since the death of Floyd, we have been looking at, in Scotland anyway, on statues, the built environment. And I was involved in a very important project in the middle of Edinburgh. There's a statue there, which was built to a very famous politician called Henry Dundas. And if I say to you, have you heard of William Wilberforce? And you will say yes, he was from Hull, and he was involved in the abolition of the slave trade. But if I say, have you heard of Henry Dundas? And you said no, then really you know nothing about William Wilberforce. And that's the power of this history. Certain bits are missing. And Henry Dundas is critical to an understanding of William Wilberforce. Because in 1792, when Wilberforce was trying to abolish the slave trade, he put in a bill, and Dundas amended the bill. And he said that the slave trade should be gradually abolished. And that one word, gradual, delayed the abolition of the slave trade from 1792 to 1807, 15 years. And on his statue in the middle of Edinburgh, Henry Dundas, that feature of his power was not on his plaque. And cut a long story short, I lobbied the council. And 2 years ago, we discussed it, and the plaque was changed. And the plaque now contains the statement that he gradually abolished the slave trade, causing over 500,000 Africans to be transported into slavery. And the plaque is dedicated to those who suffered. Of course, this was not accepted by historians, nor the family. And up until a couple of weeks ago, the family was still trying to get the plaque removed. And what that says, people are more concerned about the truth being made public than they're really worried about statues being removed. A lot of people would rather that statue be removed than to put the truth on it. And therefore, in terms of our history, and I call it our history, we have to learn the details. And the details of the recent incident, and I will deal with that because it would be abrogating my responsibilities not to. That is related to the fact that in 1753 and after that, David Hume, the great mind of the Enlightenment, said that Negroes were inferior to whites. He said that. The point is that Emmanuel Kant picked that up, and he said the Negro race was inferior to the white race. And slavers used that myth, because they had no evidence, to actually justify the enslavement of Black people in the British Caribbean. At the end of slavery, Britain had 800,000 slaves in the Caribbean. in 1838. Jamaica had 300,000. Jamaica was one of the prize areas of British slavery. So if you've ever heard of Rodney Street in England and in Scotland, and maybe in Wales, I don't know. But Rodney Street reflects one of the most important naval battles in the history of the British Navy, because the French were going to take Jamaica in 1782 in order to reduce the British economy. And of course, Britain fought for Jamaica while they were ignoring America, because Jamaica at the time was more important than America, with its 300,000 slaves, providing over 50% of the income from slavery for Britain. And therefore, Rodney won that battle. And even Robert Burns refers to it. Here's a toast to the boys we lost on the glorious 12th of April. May their fame live forever. That's the general context of what Robert Burns said. So that victory was known widely. And therefore, the point I'm trying to make is that Britain's slavery and the racism associated with it through humankind have passed down to us. It's in Windrush, and it's in this statement which Diane Abbott, the MP, was involved in, because she mistakenly realized that race is an entity. There is no definition. I can ask you now to define race immediately, and I don't think nobody in that hall could. It's a word we use, but we really don't know what it means. And what it now means is that the racism Black people suffered during slavery and since, that racism now could be described as, and I've tried to do that recently by just saying it's an ethnic, I would say it is ethnic related abuse, because now that racism can apply to white people like the Irish or the Jewish people, but it can also apply to mixed race people, Black people. And therefore, in fact, race is now related to ethnicity. And therefore, that's quite all right, because it never meant anything before that anyway. It was a description to denigrate Black people, saying, you know, they were inferior to white people. And that's the complexity. But it's not really complex if you know it and understand it. And finally, because again of the time factor, and I know it's with the delay, and I don't want to take too long over this. So finally, we have a slavery that made a lot of people rich. In England, you had the family of the Beckfords, you know, and Beckford, Susan Beckford, she was on about £10,000 a year from her father, and she married the Duke of Hamilton, the 10th Duke of Hamilton in Scotland. And that was the relationship between the money and the power of slavery. You also have in Scotland and England, where Sir John Glassford, we have Glassford Street in Glasgow, and he was a tobacco lord. And he had a painting with this little Black boy in it, which people tried to hide. And, you know, it then reappeared not long ago. So that's tobacco. But we also have the Edinburgh family of Gladstone, the famous four-time Prime Minister of Queen Victoria times. His father was Sir John Gladstone. And Sir John Gladstone received at the compensation, which I referred to, where slave owners were compensated. Sir John Gladstone had 2,508 slaves, for which he got 83 million in today's money. And therefore, in fact, you could say the Beckfords in England, probably the richest man in England at the time, William Beckford. And you had Sir John Gladstone in Scotland, father of the Prime Minister, who got 83 million for his slaves. And therefore, that's the kind of riches and that's the kind of money that is important in our built environment in England and in Scotland and in Wales. And therefore, what we now have to look at is race and racism and its understanding. And I'll leave that with you. What it is that human beings are really one humanity. There is no other biological definition that is valid. We are the only animal on earth where, in fact, are being persecuted because of skin color. We don't do it to any other animal. The fact is that, finally, we are one humanity, nothing less. And we have to do everything because we cannot change the past, but we can change consequences, such as racism, for the better, using education. Thank you.
But it's great to have the opportunity to present at this conference. I'm Errol Francis. I'm Artistic Director of Culture and I'm going to talk to you about space, time and empire. And it's very much a response to Greenwich itself, which I just couldn't resist, actually. I mean, why not? You know, because we're talking about World Heritage and monuments and we're in one. And I am a visiting lecturer at this university, and I'm also engaged in quite a large piece of work on EDI with Royal Museums Greenwich. So it just seemed really relevant to kind of join up this conversation. This is very much an artistic response to Greenwich and the program that we're going to do there. And in spite of the rather abstract title, it's meant to bring out some stories that we need to tell much better about this World Heritage Site. And this is why I'm calling it Time, Space and Empire, which is a post-colonial exploration of Greenwich, of the World Heritage Site in association with RMG and the university. So this photograph, which is from the World Heritage Site, really just sums up the complexity actually of the architecture and the landscape and geography. And in fact, it's kind of disparate, fractured nature. There's so many different people that look after the sites. You've got the Royal Park, you've got the university, you've got the museum, you've got the Greenwich Foundation, you've got the World Heritage Site. You know, it's quite interesting. And yet there is a joined up story to tell, and that's what I wanted to talk about. So yeah, I'm Director of Culture, and I'll tell you a bit more about the charity in a moment. But I really want to talk about how we're going to be engaging with this World Heritage Site, which I think is one of the most complex in the UK in terms of telling the story, as well as its topography. We want to share with you, these are very sort of outlined plans yet, so I'm not giving you details about exactly the events, if you like, that are going to take place, but rather our approach to responding to different parts of the site. Whilst I must say, whilst Culture and could be described as a community stakeholder, these are all rather contested terms. You know, when people say community, what exactly do we mean? Which bit of it do we mean? But we believe it's a program that's about addressing the heritage of empire, and we could discuss to what extent it is a rights-based approach, and most controversially for me, whether or not it's decolonisation, a word that I rarely use because to describe my work, because I find it deeply problematic. But anyway, it's a work in progress. So just to tell you a bit about Culture, and we were formed in 1987, and the mission has always been to open up arts and heritage, to open up who makes and enjoys arts and heritage. And that means opening up the workforce as well as audiences. We're Black-led, and we became an Arts Council MPO this month. And we have a mission to diversify the UK culture sector in terms of workforce and audiences. We're based in London and Staffordshire University. We have a core team comprised of myself, a development director, program manager, administrator, and so on. And this is going to be expanded with the NPO funding. And I'm very proud to be to have our chair as Miranda Lowe, who is principal curator. at the Natural History Museum. We work with various arts and heritage organisations all over the UK, and our biggest programme is the New Museum School. It's a studentship programme that we run at Leicester University. We've got 30 students on that programme, fully funded studentships at the moment, and actually we're just about to start a similar scheme with the Sotheby's Institute of Art, and we do consultancy, research and public programmes. So that's a selection of the relationships that we have to maintain with the sector, which is very complicated, but necessary, and I think rewarding and impactful. Why Greenwich? It seems to me that it's a crucial site in terms of the British heritage landscape, in terms of what is represented here in terms of maritime history and the importance of that history to the colonial project and empire. And there is an exclusion of communities in the interpretation and management of the site. Now, one of the things this is really striking about Greenwich, being here at the university, I teach at the university, when I go to my class at the university, it looks like London. You know, it's diverse, it's got all sorts of people. And literally you cross Rumney Road, right, and go into the museum, and you think you're in a different place, right? I recently had a meeting with the curatorial team there. It's 100% white, right? So, and we're working to change that. But I think this exclusion really comes out, not just in the workforce, but in the interpretation itself. And the fractured nature of the site leads to a lack of an interpretation of the site as a whole, of telling that story as a whole. Why are all these buildings here? Why is the Cutty site there? Why is the old Royal Naval College there? Why is the Queen's House there? Where is the Palace of Placentia? All these questions that are not immediately ordered. So it leads to an exclusive heritage, which Stuart Hall described in his famous essay, Whose Heritage? A heritage which is weighted towards nationalism rather than bringing out these stories. And yet, I'm super excited about it because it's such a possible test bed to tell these stories in a more expanded interpretation. By way of thematic introduction, this particular passage from Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, I find completely haunting. It's a book that has problems with it elsewhere, but this particular opening where he describes the Thames, the tidal current running to and fro, its unceasing service, the crowded memories of men and ships that had borne the rest of home to the battles of the sea, it had known and served all the men whom the nation is proud. Sir Francis Drake's, John Hawkins, knights, all titled and untitled, great, he goes on, talking about the ships and their rotund flanks full of treasure. And then he mentions they all sailed from Deptford, from Greenwich, from Erith, and what greatness had not floated on the ebb of that river into the mystery of an unknown earth. And I find this passage really incredible in terms of framing Greenwich, if you like, and connecting the World Heritage Site with the river, which I don't think is done very well if you walk around it, to work out, well, how do all these buildings relate to the river? What's the importance of the Thames and so on? So this is a really important thematic introduction for us in terms of how we see the site and how we're going to interpret it. We have objectives that the Arts Council is holding us to, and we're very happy to be held to these objectives because we want to join together the fractured story of Greenwich and engage an audience with the significance of Greenwich to British maritime power through the story of time and space by responding to the architecture, the landscape, the park itself, and the history of the various buildings on and around the site. We want to use this to provide curatorial opportunities for our students that I've mentioned that are at Leicester, for example, to be involved in education, production opportunities, and create programs that will help to expand audiences. And we want to provide opportunities for diverse artists, scholars, and performers to contribute to the program and to engage with expanded audiences. But we want to explore British identity, and British identity includes us, through the concept of time and space. And in fact, this program started years ago with a conference that was at University of Greenwich called Being British. And one of the installations that I fondly remember for that event was Chris O'Philly black version of the Union Jack that was flying outside the old Royal Naval College. So we want to commemorate Greenwich as an iconic site of British colonial history and engage diverse audiences that may be interested in Greenwich but who have not visited before. But we also want to engage those people who have visited before but would like to learn more about the relationship between time, space, and empire. So there are a number of strategic sites that we want to make these interventions. And of course, if you're going to talk about time and space, you've got to deal with the observatory. There's the Queen's House, along which the meridian passes. And there's the Old Royal Naval College, formerly the Greenwich Hospital. And a space that I find fascinating, and a lot of people don't know, is here, is the Jacobean Undercroft in the Queen Anne building of the Old Royal Naval College. And I'll come back to why we're interested in that in a moment. And then there's the University of Greenwich itself, and the Stephen Lawrence Gallery over there, the new bit, but where it started was in the old building, and we want to make an intervention there. And then there's a Cutty Sark, right? So why the observatory? Because there is an object in there that I just find totally fascinating, and it's the marine chronometer that was invented by John Harrison, who was an incredible guy, you know, self-taught man who solved the problem of longitude. There was a competition, and he invented this timepiece, the marine chronometer. Now, the problem of longitude was basically about knowing your place at sea, your distance from where you started, and the time of where you are. So that's the time and space bit. It may sound abstract, but it's really important because a lot of ships were being lost. A lot of money was being lost because of this not being able to solve this problem. And Harrison solved it with this incredible, there were various versions of the marine chronometer. This is version, I think this is H4, but I think it went up higher than that. But the bit about this that I love to remember is that in its trials, the H4 version was sent on voyages to Kingston, Jamaica. You've just heard about Kingston, Jamaica. And then it went to Barbados. It only lost half a second, right, as it went all that distance. So it's an incredibly accurate timepiece. But what it demonstrates is this relationship between keeping time, space, oops, I'm sorry, space, but geographical space, or you might call it geopolitical space. You know, who masters space, who masters time, masters the world, you could argue. So I think telling this story from a post-colonial point of view is very important. But the other thing about the observatory is the meridian, the prime meridian, which passes through there. And I think a lot of people might think that this is a sort of natural phenomenon, you know, 0 degrees longitude, yes, in Greenwich. How did it get there? Why did it get there? What is the, if you like, the conceptual implications of having it there? So it's like, this is the dividing line between East and West. These are terms that we use, the West, you know, the rest of the world. But it was not always so. There were many different meridians operating before 1884. And if you go on the Royal Museum's website, what it says, the reason why it ended up in Greenwich was because 72% of ships were registered in this part of the world, and the conference was in the United States, and so it was just agreed. But then you think, well, why were so many ships registered? What was British maritime power, and how comes it was here? France wanted it. France voted against. But you know, it could be anywhere. This particular 0 could be anywhere. But it has tremendous conceptual and importance in terms of the significance, and lots of tourists come there, and it gives Britain this sort of axial importance in terms of the world's surface. But I think it's something that we need to explore and open out the story about this meridian, and the also the issue about longitude. Another building on the site, the Queen's site, by Inigo Jones. It's credited as the first Renaissance building in England. And in some ways, you could describe it as a prime example of cultural diversity, in the sense that this style that comes to England from Europe revolutionizes English, British architecture. That's one reason why you could celebrate it if you like. But our interest in it is the painting collection. And there are two paintings in there that we are fascinated by. One of them is The Ship of Fools by Kehinde Wiley. It's a recent, I think, 2017 work, which is a response to altarpiece by Hieronymus Bosch, which is really important that this painting is in the collection and does acknowledge the colonial experience. But I'm also interested in this one of the three Armada portraits of Elizabeth I. And the reason is because of the relationship between this monarch, her dynasty, the Tudors, and this place, Greenwich, and the palace, which we can no longer see anymore. And to tell this story about maritime power through the Tudors, if you like. So this painting, as you see at the back, the Spanish Armada being dashed by the storms, you know, so it's a triumphalist painting. But when you look closely at Elizabeth's hand, it's the Americas that, you know, the globe, it's the Americas that are facing it. And it really does, it's a prescient picture in terms of the direction of British maritime power. And I think we not only want to reinterpret this painting, as was recently done by Peter Adjei in the Queen's House. All three versions of this painting were hung together. It was amazing. It looked like an Andy Warhol. You know, there were three versions of Elizabeth. But, and Peter did a sound piece, but we feel we want to revisit this. And the interpretation has yet to be decided, but we're in conversation with RMG and we're really excited that they want to work with us on this reinterpretation. So this is what I was talking about, the Jacobean undercraft. This is the only bit of the Palace of Placentia. This is the palace that the Tudors lived in, the Greenwich Palace, that exists. It's a bit that's underneath the old Royal Naval College. So we want to interrogate the role of the Tudor dynasty in launching British maritime power, especially during the reigns of Henry, Edward, Elizabeth, and the latter, her support for the voyages of people like Raleigh and Drake and Hawkins. But again, it's one of these things that when I talk about joining up the site, is that I'll speak about how we're going to do that digitally then to give the visitor experience to connect these different sites. Because I think when people come onto the World Heritage Site, it's experienced in a series of fragments because of the different people that own the various buildings. And what we want to do is connect these different, the objects that I mentioned, but also the buildings and the topography itself. So we're very excited about the opening up this particular area and having an installation there that talks about the Tudors and colonialism. So then the Painted Hall, when I was writing about this, and I also wrote about this when I was doing my research at Central St Martin's, and I was fascinated by it. There was a paper about the Baroque aesthetics and the spatial infinity. This is the illusion of space that you get with Baroque paintings and Baroque architecture. And there were two writers there were a husband and wife team called the Balakiers, who wrote about the spatial infinity in the architecture of Christopher Wren at Greenwich. And it's a really interesting thing when you think of the subjective experience of the architecture and what you're meant to feel. When you look through the old Royal Naval College, this symmetrical vista down from the Queen's House, the architecture, the perspective is forcing you out into the distance. This is outside the building before we get inside. One of the things that people may not realize is the way the modern buildings over at Canary Wharf are framed by this view of the distance. But guess what? The building, you know, the building with the pyramid over at Canary Wharf, that's in a square called Cabot Square. And I'm wondering who thought of this incredible, you know, reference to an explorer, a maritime explorer, and to see this vista being framed from Greenwich, forcing you to look out into the distance, into the infinity that Joseph Conrad talks about, this infinite space of empire that is ripe for expansion and exploitation. But I would also say that inside the building, this Baroque, which is a literal translation of misshapen pearl, so spatial distortion, time warping, spatial warping, is what you get inside the building. As you can see from this detail here, and then you see the famous murals by Sir James Thornhill. But one of the things you may not notice actually, that in the ceiling in the painted hall, one of the people floating up into infinite space is the first astronomer royal, Flamsteed. He's up there, you know, in infinite space. And I think this whole spatial illusion is something that we want to look at and to interpret with installations in the painted hall. And of course, as you know, the murals themselves talk about the English Protestant succession with the monarchs from William and Mary onwards, you know, so this is incredibly politically important. So for us to be part of that family of succession, and which, you know, Stuart Hall talked about as unbelonging, this sense of unbelonging that heritage often produces in people, and intervening into these spaces is crucially important for us to produce a sense of belonging. Another hidden, sometimes I think of this quotation of the Bible, the evidence of things not seen. And this particular thing is a piece of evidence that you can't see very well, but we want to bring out, and it's not very well known, that Britton Hammond was one of the earliest people, enslaved people, to write an autobiographical narrative about his experience. And he lived in the Greenwich Hospital and wrote this extraordinary book, whose title is so long that you can't, but it's an incredible book that narrates his, you know, his experience of trying to escape from enslavement, being stowed aboard on a British man of war, and he ends up serving in the British Navy. He gets attacked, the ship gets attacked by the French, he gets wounded, and he stays in Greenwich Hospital. You know, and people who want to say that the Black presence in the UK started in 1948 need to know about these stories, because Greenwich and Deptford were rather more diverse than we think they were in the 18th century, and Britton Hammond was just one of them. And we really want to revisit his amazing story and make this more widely known. And then there's tea, the Cutty Sark. Right now, I mentioned that we were in one of our bases in Stoke-on-Trent, and I recently, and my team, we recently went to the Wedgwood Museum. Right now, we were actually looking for the famous medallion, and we couldn't find it. It wasn't there, but it kind of made us concentrate on the collection in a different way, because we were looking at it thinking, there's so many objects in this collection for making tea and holding sugar. Right, and does anybody really want to tell this story? And a somewhat ironic aspect of this, that Josiah Wedgwood himself being anti-slavery, but we think of his customers. This is a somewhat, we haven't done the research. It's a supposition if you think about it. Royalty, the people who are buying the pots and so on. Anyway, we think that the Cutty Sark is an opportunity to kind of revisit this significance about tea, introduced, you know, in the early 17th century, and you know, it's through royalty. Catherine of Braganza, wife of Charles II, who has also an important relationship with the Commission of Buildings on the World Heritage Site, Charles II, yeah, we'd like to. You know, there's just so many sub-narratives, but you know, the Opium Wars, the importance of tea in terms of the British economy, But this vessel and the wealth that it created, the fact it was so fast, and what that meant for profits and so on. So what we're thinking of is interventions in these various sites on around the Greenwich World Heritage Site. So to conclude, these interventions that aimed at joining together the fractured history of the World Heritage Site and telling a more coherent story about maritime Greenwich and the British Empire. I'm really excited that I got an email from the founder of Smartify, who wants to work with us because we want to get a blue badge guide of Greenwich to help audiences experience a more coherent story. And we also think that elements of the programme could travel to Liverpool for obvious reasons, but Stoke, as I've mentioned, because of the potteries, for example. And we believe our programme could serve or will serve as a model for the interpretation of heritage sites with colonial histories and with links with empire. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I have the heavy responsibility to be the last speaker of this intense and fascinating day. Yeah. So my name is Jean-François Manicom. I am the son of Robert Manicom, the grandson of Grand Robert Manicom, the great-grandson of Carmen Jachima Adem, the father of Cassandre, Raphael, Alma, and the grandfather of Matteo and Talia. I'm not here to tell my family's complicated story, but I want you to understand that I'm not alone in front of you. I represent myself as being in a chain of uninterrupted life since Neanderthal, heir of my ancestors, and responsible for what I transmit to those who come after me. This is how I register myself in the world. It is with this mind that I conduct my personal life, but also my professional life. I grew up in a family of the petite bourgeoisie of Guadeloupe, extracted itself from a social class of poor peasants. For my mother, the salvation and the social scale necessarily passed through the appropriation of the knowledge, culture of the dominant world, and for Guadeloupe, its France. This is how I have, since my very young age, traveled in Europe. I visited the monuments, the theaters, the cathedrals, the castles, the abbeys, the tangible and solid trace of how people love their territories, the traces of power, the traces of money, materialized in walls, in building. During my holidays, my mother made us make one visit per day on average. And trust her, I have an extensive knowledge of the European built heritage. When in September, after the period of holidays, and during the hurricane period, I was going back home in the Caribbean, the child that I was lost. Where was my heritage? Where was my inheritance? Why no one had ever had the desire, the money, the power, and above all, the love of place to also build statues, castles, cathedrals, beautiful, sumptuous, and useless building in my own country? Why even the mansions of the masters were only big wooden functionalist farms? I put it again because it's a kind of loop. And it was with this sense of emptiness, this sense of dispossession, this sense of cultural and architectural inferiority, this lack of a solid heritage, that I breed myself, like all of my generation, and before it, my mother's generation. It took a very long time, and I had to become a father myself, to understand that it was impossible not to want to pass on legacies to those who come after you. And I set out in search of what was left to me. I discovered a whole world. I discovered, more precisely, an approach to the world, a way of being to the world, an heritage that I call fragile and strong heritage. And I say fragile without any connotation of weakness. Fragile does not mean weak or less strong. And this is the reason why I put this background. I make the choice of those two very powerful artists, visual artists, Benji Reed and Gilles Dicozak, because I think that they are perfectly able to visually represent what is the complex notion of fragile and strong legacies. And I think that it is the power of contemporary art. Reason why I think that working in the field of slavery with contemporary art, and when I say contemporary art, I say visual artists, but also novelists, performers, etc., sculptors, etc. So my heritage is the ability to create a language of bricolage, the ability to resist, to survive, to ingest a society, its culture and its code, to create a new one. My heritage is resilience, resistance at all costs, mistrust in the order established, the distrust in the common world enacted in rule or dogma. My inheritance is to know the price and value of transmitting life and hope, despite and against everything. It is also the slow and permanent sabotage of the production tool when this production tool is crushing men. One day, I had the opportunity and the chance to visit the Kwashi Museum of the indigenous people of Oiapoque. It is far in the north of Brazil. I visited the permanent collection, and in the silence of the place, I little realized that the entire collection, placed in the forest, would have been swallowed and digested by the forest in less than 3 years. The building itself, mainly made of wood and cement, would disappear in less than 50 years. Who is the best equipped to inhabit sustainably the planet? It is the human whose trace disappear, or the human whose impact and footprint is to stay forever. This visit for a museum professional that I was a huge shock and allowed me to better understand that, that I was vain to look in the wrong direction. In Guadeloupe, where I come from, the legacy of slavery lies in the soul and lies in the fact that these tiny territories became laboratories of the world, where we experience the blending of creolization. It is in our literature, in our music, it's live in the body of our athletes. When I arrived in Liverpool in 2015, 16, I understood the why of our world story. It was money and the lure of gains. Money and the power that was behind it stood there in front of me, in the size of the monuments, in the facades of the bank, and in the property of the merchants, in the three graces of Liverpool, the Royal Liver Building, the Cunard Building, the Port of Liverpool Building. It was the motive for the pride and its transformation into stones. I now have the chance to work at the Museum of London Docklands in what was warehouse number 1 and is now a grade 1 building. It is a popular museum with an average daily frequentation of 1,000 people a day, and very few people imagine that it was not always a public building and that its career is more than 200 years in the private interest service and barely 20 years in the service of the community. Very few people note that the window peaks that are similar to those who was in prison are traces of the harshness of the working condition of those who spend their life unleashing what my ancestors has produced. Now in 2023, where we are, in a world where global warming is changing the way we live on Earth, in a world where the easy and cheap resources that have been overexploited since the Industrial Revolution are drying up, we are at the dawn of a new way of living in the world. This is a new challenge for our children's children. In this world of extension that demands to be reinvented, the thickness of 1 meter walls in an heritage castle is not for help. I say with pride on behalf of all enslaved descendants that we possess the skills that we can share to the world. In the monoculture plantation, a single mode of capitalist production, our ancestors already cultivated the art of survival in a very tiny gardens called Jardin Créole, or sometimes slave garden. They was able to feed themselves and their family, to plant herbs that they turn into efficient medicine. It is this fragile legacy, this fragile heritage of resistance coming from my enslaved great-great-grandmother that I propose to share as a world heritage to the whole humanity. Black people have something colossal to contribute to today's biggest challenge to build the future. And trust me, it's not common stones. Thank you very much.